Elliot Whitfield didn't knock. He walked into the dying man's room like he owned it, because in his mind, he already did. He stood at the foot of Caleb Thornton's bed, hat in hand, not out of respect but because the ceiling was low and he was a tall man who liked to remind people of it. He looked at Caleb, pale, sweating through the sheets, barely able to lift his head, and he smiled. Not a cruel smile, something worse, a patient one. "I'll give you a fair price for the land," Elliot said, "and I'll take the boy somewhere he won't have to watch his father rot." Caleb's hand trembled as he gripped the iron bed frame. "Get out of my house." Elliot set his hat back on his head. "I'll be back in 3 days, Caleb. I expect you'll be more reasonable by then." He paused at the door. "Or you won't be anything at all." If this story already has your heart, you're exactly who this channel was made for. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next, because the stories we tell here don't let go easy. Tap the like button if you feel something, and drop a comment telling me your city, your country, wherever in the world you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1882, and to a woman who walked into a dying man's room and walked out changed forever. Grace Whitmore had $43, a suitcase held shut with a leather belt because the latch had broken somewhere outside of Cheyenne, and a letter she'd already read so many times the fold lines had worn white. The letter wasn't long. It was from a merchant named Aldous Fry, written on behalf of a man who couldn't hold a pen steady enough to write it himself. It said there was a situation. It said there was a child involved. It said the pay would be $2 a week for housekeeping and cooking, with lodging included, and that speed was essential. Grace had taken the stage north without fully understanding why. She told herself it was the money. Wyoming winters were brutal, and she had no stove, no relatives worth the name, and no particular reason to stay in Cheyenne. She told herself the letter was a practical arrangement, and she was a practical woman. She'd been lying to herself for so long it came easy. The town of Larkin appeared the way most frontier towns did, like something dropped from a height and left where it landed. A main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon with a busted shutter banging in the wind, and half a dozen buildings that couldn't quite decide what they were. The stage stopped in front of Fry's Mercantile, and Grace stepped down into ankle-deep mud and stood there for a moment with her suitcase in both hands, looking at the town looking back at her. A boy was sitting on the Mercantile steps. He was small for 7, with dark hair that hadn't seen a comb in a while and boots that were too big, probably handed down. He was holding a stick and drawing something in the dirt, slow, deliberate lines. And he didn't look up when the stage came in, didn't look up when the other passengers got off. He only looked up when Grace walked toward him, because he must have sensed something different about her footsteps. His eyes were gray, the same gray as an overcast sky that can't decide between rain and clearing. "Are you the woman who's coming for the housekeeping?" he asked. "I am," Grace said. "My name's Grace." The boy considered this. "I'm Owen. My pa's upstairs." He looked back at the dirt. "He doesn't look good." I heard he was unwell." Owen drew another line. "He's dying," he said, the same way a child says it's going to rain. Flat. Already certain. Already carrying it. Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. She just stood there for a second, and then Owen stood up and led her inside. Aldous Fry was waiting behind his counter, a short man with spectacles and the particular anxious energy of someone who has been managing a crisis that isn't his and is very tired of it. He came around the counter fast when Grace walked in, shook her hand too hard, and started talking before she'd had a chance to set her suitcase down. "Miss Whitmore, good that you're here. The situation has become... It's more urgent than when I wrote the letter." He lowered his voice, though there was no one else in the store. "The Whitfields came this morning, Elliot Whitfield specifically. He was up there for maybe 10 minutes. Whatever he said to Caleb, the man's been asking for you since." "He's been asking for me," Grace said. "He doesn't know me. He knows what he needs." Fry took off his spectacles and polished them, which Grace was already recognizing as his nervous habit. "I should tell you up front, what he's going to ask you, it's not just housekeeping." Grace looked at the stairs. Then she looked at Owen, who had followed them inside and was standing near the door, still holding his stick. "What is it?" she said. Fry put his spectacles back on. "He'll tell you himself. I think it's better that way." The room at the top of the stairs smelled like fever. That particular sharp, sweet smell that Grace knew from nursing her mother through a bad winter 12 years ago. a smell that meant the body was fighting something hard and not winning. There was a single window with the curtain half pulled, and in the yellow afternoon light she could see the man in the bed clearly enough. Caleb Thornton looked like a man who had been strong recently. The kind of strong that doesn't disappear overnight but is still visible in the frame. The width of the shoulders, the large hands resting on the blanket, the jaw that was set even now, even sick. He was maybe 35, maybe a year or two older. It was hard to tell when a man was this far down. His dark hair was damp against his forehead. His face was the color of old candle wax, but his eyes were open, and they were sharp. "You're Grace Whitmore," he said. His voice was rough, like something dragged over gravel. "I am." "Sit down." He didn't say, "Please." Not rude, just direct, like a man who knew he didn't have time for soft edges. Grace pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside the bed. She set her suitcase on the floor. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, because she had a feeling that whatever came next was going to require her to sit very still. Caleb watched her for a moment, taking stock. She let him. "How much did Fry tell you?" he asked. "That you needed a housekeeper, that there was a child, and that whatever you want to ask me, you'd rather say it yourself." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He told you I was dying?" "Yorson told me." Something moved across his face at that. Not exactly pain. Something older than pain. "Owen shouldn't be carrying that," he said quietly. "He's carrying it whether you like it or not," Grace said. "Children know things." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I need you to marry me." The room went very quiet. "I have maybe 3 days," he said. "The doctor's been honest with me. Infection in the leg from a cattle crush. It's not going to get better. My fever goes higher every night." He paused to gather his breath. Even that much talking cost him something. "Eliza, my wife, Owen's mother, she died 2 years ago. Her family is the Whitfields. You know that name?" "I don't," Grace said. "I'm from Cheyenne. I only came to Larkin this afternoon." "Good," he said. "Then I'll tell you straight. The Whitfields run the biggest cattle operation in this part of Wyoming. Eliza's father, Harold, and her brother, Elliot. They've wanted this land since before Eliza died, and they've wanted Owen since before that." His voice dropped, went harder. "They're not bad men in the way that's obvious. They don't threaten outright. They just arrange things. And if I die without legal protection in place, they will take Owen into their house and raise him as theirs, and this land will go to debt collection, because they'll see to it that every debt I have comes due the same week." Grace sat with that. "I don't understand how my marrying you changes that," she said. "It gives Owen a legal guardian who isn't a Whitfield. As my wife, you'd have the right to contest custody. And Fry, he's the one good lawyer in 40 miles. He tells me there's a decent chance a judge would honor it." Caleb's hand shifted on the blanket. "I'm not asking for anything else from you. No. No pretense. I know what this is. I know what I'm asking." "What happens to me after?" Grace said. "When you're gone. The land and the house would be yours. I've got about $300 in the bank. It's not much, but it's not nothing." He met her eyes. "I know it's not enough. I know there's no good reason you should do this. But I don't have anyone else. And Fry says you've got nothing tying you to Cheyenne, and Owen..." He stopped. His throat worked. "Owen's already lost his mother. I don't want him to lose everything." Grace looked at her hands. She thought about the $43 in her coat pocket. She thought about the boy downstairs with the stick and the 2 big boots and the flat voice that said, "He's dying the way the sky says it's going to rain." She thought about the man on the stairs with the patient smile. "Tell me about the Whitfields," she said. Caleb talked for 20 minutes, stopping twice to cough, once to wait while Grace poured him water from the pitcher on the nightstand. He told her about Harold Whitfield, the patriarch 70 years old and still sharp as any blade, the kind of man who had built an empire by making sure every favor he did came with strings attached. He told her about Elliot, the son, younger and smoother and more dangerous because he liked to seem reasonable right up until he wasn't. He told her about Eliza. Not much, just enough. That she'd loved Owen ferociously. That she'd fought her own family over this land, this life, this marriage to a working cowboy who didn't have their money or their name. That when she died of fever in February of 1880, the Whitfields had sat at her funeral with grief on their faces and ambition in their eyes. "Elliot was here this morning," Caleb said. "I heard. He said he'd give me a fair price for the land." His mouth twisted. "Said he'd take Owen somewhere he wouldn't have to watch his father rot." He looked at the ceiling. "That's a direct quote." Grace felt something cold move through her chest. "He said that to you." Smiled when he said it. Caleb's eyes came back to hers. That's what Owen is to them. He's the land deal that comes with a child attached. Eliza's blood, yes, and I think Harold loves him in his way, but Elliot, he shook his head. Elliot sees things in terms of what they're worth. Grace stood up. She walked to the window and looked down at the main street of Larkin, which was just beginning to gather its late afternoon activity. A wagon pulling up in front of the livery, a woman sweeping a doorstep, 2 men talking outside the saloon. Normal. Ordinary. A town that didn't know and didn't particularly care what was happening in this room. She turned around. If I do this, she said, what's to stop the Whitfields from challenging the marriage? Saying you were too sick to make decisions? Caleb had clearly already thought about this. The doctor and the preacher both. Fry's already spoken to them. Dr. Hale says he'll testify that I was feverish but aware. He's been in that room enough to know. And Reverend he stopped. The man who does the ceremony. He'll say the same. You've planned this out. I've had time to think, Caleb said. Not much else to do when you're flat on your back. Grace looked at him, at the sick, stubborn man in the bed who had spent his deteriorating days not mourning himself, but trying to protect his son. I need to sleep on it, she said. I don't have the time to... 1 night, she said firmly. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need 1 night. That's what I'm asking for. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded, once. 1 night, he said. She slept in the small room Fry had prepared off the back of the mercantile, and she lay awake for most of it. She thought about every way this could go wrong, which was a long list. She thought about what it would mean to be a widow in Wyoming with a child that wasn't hers, and land she didn't know how to work, and a family of powerful strangers who wanted it all back. She thought about Owen. Around 2 a.m, she heard footsteps in the hall and then the creak of the stairs, and she knew without being able to see that it was the boy going up to his father's room. She listened to the sound of the steps, slow and careful, a child trying not to wake anyone. She got up at dawn. She washed her face, put on her second dress, the better one, and walked upstairs and knocked on the door. Owen opened it. He was sitting in the chair by the bed with a blanket around his shoulders, asleep when she knocked and now blinking at her with his gray eyes. You came back, he said. I said I would. Caleb was awake. He looked worse than the day before. The fever had climbed overnight, that much was visible, but his eyes were still clear when they found hers. I'll do it, Grace said. Caleb exhaled. Something in him seemed to loosen, like a rope pulled to its limit, finally given an inch of slack. You don't have to. I said I'll do it, Grace said again, not unkindly. Don't argue with me about it now. Owen looked between them. He didn't say anything, but his hand, which had been holding the edge of his blanket tight, slowly let go. They were married that afternoon. Fry fetched the preacher. Dr. Hale came and stood near the window with his arms folded and his face professionally neutral, though Grace caught him watching Caleb with something that looked like worried respect. The ceremony was 4 minutes long. Caleb sat up as straight as he could manage, and Grace sat in the chair beside him because there was no standing at a bedside wedding, and they said the words to each other with Owen between them, his small back pressed against the edge of the bed. When it was done, the preacher left. Fry filed the papers. Dr. Hale checked Caleb's temperature, wrote something in his notebook, and told Grace quietly at the door that she should prepare herself. He's getting worse, the doctor said. I want to be honest with you. I know, Grace said. The fever may break. Sometimes they do. Dr. Hale put on his hat. But the infection, he shook his head. I'll come back tomorrow morning. Grace stood in the doorway and watched him go. Then she turned around and looked at the room that was now, technically, partly hers. At the man in the bed who was now, legally, her husband. At the boy who was now, by any practical measure, her responsibility. She thought, what have I done? And then she thought, what do I do now? She rolled up her sleeves. The first week was the hardest thing Grace had ever done, and she'd done hard things. She cooked 3 meals a day on the small iron stove in the ranch house kitchen, which was a 15-minute walk from Fry's Mercantile and was where she moved herself and Owen the morning after the wedding. The house was not in good shape, not falling down bad, but neglected. The way things get neglected when a man is spending all his energy on survival rather than maintenance. Dishes stacked and unwashed, floors unswept, a window in the back room with a crack stuffed with a rag, the pantry nearly bare. She made a list of what needed doing and started at the top. Owen helped, or tried to. He was 7 and he moved carefully, like he'd learned that if he stayed quiet and useful, no one would send him away. Grace noticed this, and it bothered her more than almost anything else. She set him tasks that were real, not busy work, actual tasks, carrying firewood, filling the water basin, sweeping the steps. And when he did them, she said, "Good work," without making a performance of it, because she could tell he didn't trust performances. She moved Caleb to the ranch on the third day over Dr. Hale's hesitation and with Fry's wagon. Caleb argued weakly about the disruption, and she told him that if he was going to die, he ought to do it in his own bed, and that if he wasn't going to die, he needed to be somewhere he could recover properly, and either way, the mercantile room was needed for other purposes. "You're a hard woman," Caleb said. "I'm a practical one," Grace said. He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect, if he hadn't been too sick to fully feel anything. The fever peaked on the 5th night. Grace had been watching for it. Dr. Hale had told her what to look for, the point where the fever stops climbing and either breaks or doesn't. She'd been checking on Caleb every 2 hours, sleeping in the chair in the hallway outside his room because she didn't have another bed set up yet, and Owen was in the only other bedroom. At 2 in the morning, she heard him. Not words, just a sound. Low, rough, the kind a man makes when the pain comes through the unconsciousness. She was in the room before she was fully awake. He was burning. She could feel the heat coming off him from a foot away. His eyes were half open and not seeing anything in the room. "Owen," she said, loud enough to carry down the hall. She heard his feet hit the floor immediately. The boy had been sleeping light. "Get your coat on and go for Dr. Hale," she said, when Owen appeared in the doorway, still blinking. "Straight there, straight back. Don't stop for anything." "Is he—" "Go," she said. Owen went. Grace sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on Caleb's forehead and felt the full, terrible heat of it. She pulled back the blankets and began cooling him down the way she knew how. Wet cloths, cold water from the basin, a steady, methodical effort that had nothing to do with hope or fear and everything to do with the next 5 minutes and then the 5 after that. She talked to him. She wasn't sure why. He couldn't hear her, or if he couldn't make sense of it. But she talked anyway. She told him Owen had gone for the doctor. She told him she needed him to hold on. She told him she hadn't signed up for this to become a widow before she'd been a wife for a week, and that if he died on her now, she would be extremely put out about it. That last one, she didn't plan it. It just came out. And she heard herself say it and almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about the situation. Dr. Hale arrived with Owen at his heels 40 minutes later. He took one look at Caleb and began working without removing his coat. Grace stepped back and let him work. Owen pressed himself into the corner by the window, as small as he could make himself, watching. "Go back to bed," Grace said quietly to the boy. "I want to stay," he said. She looked at him, at the gray eyes that were full of something they shouldn't have to be full of at 7 years old. "All right," she said. "Sit in the chair." Owen sat in the chair. He pulled his knees up to his chest and watched the doctor work, and Grace stood near the window and watched the both of them, and the night was long. The fever broke near dawn. Dr. Hale wiped his hands on his cloth and looked at Grace with something cautious in his face. "The temperature's dropped," he said. "That's a good sign. It's not—" he chose his words. "It's not a guarantee, but it's a good sign." Grace nodded. "The infection," she said. "Still there, but the body's responding now, fighting." He rubbed his jaw. "I want to come back midday. I want to see how he looks in daylight." After the doctor left, Grace sat in the chair Owen had vacated. He'd finally fallen asleep on the small sofa in the front room around 4. And she watched Caleb sleep. The color in his face had shifted. Still pale, but a different kind of pale. Less wax, more just exhausted. Like a man at the end of a very long effort rather than the end of everything. She sat there for a while. She was very tired. She thought about Elliot Whitfield with his patient smile and his 3-day deadline. She thought about what it was going to take to keep this house standing, this child safe, this half-dead husband alive long enough to do anything about any of it. She thought, one thing at a time. She closed her eyes for 20 minutes. Just 20. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and started the fire for breakfast. By the end of the 2nd week, the town had noticed Larkin wasn't a large place. A dying man taking a wife at his deathbed was the kind of story that moved fast and stuck. Grace heard the talk when she went to the mercantile for supplies. Not directly, because no one in a small town says the thing directly, but in the way conversations shifted when she walked in the looks that were a little too careful to be friendly. She heard variations of the same theme. What kind of woman marries a man she doesn't know, on his deathbed, in a room that smells like dying? She bought her flour and her salt and her coffee and she went home. What she didn't know, because no one told her, was that the town was also watching something else. The watching had started in the second week and grown in the third. People noticed that the small Thornton ranch, which had been going to ruin for months, now had smoke coming from the chimney at regular hours. That the front step was swept. That the boy, Owen, who people had been feeling sorry for in a helpless community sort of way, was now being seen in town with a purposeful look on his face instead of that old lost one. The doctor noticed something else. On his 8th visit, he unwrapped Caleb's leg and stood for a long moment looking at it in a way that made Grace, watching from the doorway, very still. "What?" she said. Dr. Hale looked up. "The infection." He stopped, started again. "Mrs. Thornton, I need you to understand that what I'm looking at right now is not what I expected to see." "Say it plain," Grace said. "It's healing." He pointed at the wound, and even to Grace's unpracticed eye, she could see it. The edges looked different, less angry. "The deep tissue, I've been doing this for 18 years, and what I'm looking at right now is not what I expected to see a week ago." Grace felt something strange move through her chest. Not joy exactly, something more complicated than joy. "He's going to live?" she said. Dr. Hale put down his instruments. He looked at her straight. "I'm not going to say that word out loud yet because I've been surprised before in both directions. But I will say that I am no longer certain about the prognosis I gave you on the first day." He paused. "I think you should tell him." She did. She waited until Owen had gone out to feed the chickens. There were 3, and they'd been half wild and half starved when Grace arrived, and Owen had taken to them with a seriousness that she found genuinely touching. And then she sat in the chair beside Caleb's bed and told him what the doctor had said. Caleb was more awake than he'd been. Still weak. He could sit up if he went slowly, but standing was still a project. But his eyes were clear, and the color in his face had improved enough that he looked like himself again, or what she imagined himself looked like. He listened to her without speaking. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I told Owen I was going to die." "I know," Grace said. "He needs to hear it from me, that I'm not." "I know," she said again. "Grace." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Rough and direct as always, but something underneath. "I need to say something to you." "You don't have to." "I made you a deal," he said, "under terms that are now changing. I made you that deal because I thought I had 3 days. I wasn't expecting." He stopped, tried again. "The arrangement we agreed to. A widow with land and money. That's not what I'm offering you anymore." Grace looked at him. "What are you offering me now?" she said. He held her gaze. "I don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't know what I can offer you. I'm alive when I shouldn't be, and I don't have anything figured out yet." He paused. "But I wanted you to know that I know, that things changed, and that if you want to renegotiate—" "Stop," Grace said. Caleb stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Not soft, just clear. He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. Not challenging, just asking, really asking. Grace thought about it honestly, the way she'd been thinking about things since she arrived in Larkin. Without dressing the answer up. "Because Owen's already lost one mother," she said, "and because I've already scrubbed this kitchen twice, and I'm not about to let someone else benefit from that work." She stood up. "And because I think I'd like to see what happens when you can stand up on your own 2 feet again." Caleb Thornton looked at Grace Whitmore for a long moment. She couldn't read all of it, but she could read enough. "All right," he said quietly. Outside, they could hear Owen talking to the chickens. His voice was low and instructional, the way children talk to animals when they think no one is listening, explaining things with complete seriousness to creatures that will never understand. Grace walked to the door and looked out. The boy had one of the chickens cornered against the fence post and was telling it, very gravely, that it needed to stop fighting the others at feeding time because there was enough for everyone, and that behavior wasn't going to be tolerated. She felt something pull in her chest that she hadn't expected. She went to start dinner. Elliot Whitfield came back on a Thursday. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He came to Fry's Mercantile in the evening when he knew Grace would be getting supplies. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well, she would learn. And he had 2 men with him who weren't dressed well and didn't need to be. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, and the name in his mouth sounded like something he was trying out and didn't like. "Mr. Whitfield," Grace said. She kept her hands on the counter. She'd already paid for her goods, and Fry was standing nearby, busying himself with inventory in the particular careful way that meant he was listening to every word. "I heard my brother-in-law is recovering," Elliot said. "He is." "Remarkable." The word came out smooth and empty, given what everyone was saying about his prospects. He tilted his head. I wonder if the doctor might have been too quick to make his early pronouncements. I wouldn't know, Grace said. I'm not a doctor. Elliot smiled, patient, like she was being charming and he was indulging it. Mrs. Thornton, I want you to know that whatever happened, whatever arrangement was made under difficult circumstances, my family holds no ill will. We understand that people make decisions when they're frightened. I wasn't frightened, Grace said. A beat. Of course, Elliot said. I only mean that if you were to find the current situation complicated, we would be willing to make it easier. There are options that could be arranged, beneficial to everyone. Grace looked at him. She looked at the two men behind him, who weren't looking at her at all, which was its own kind of statement. She looked back at Elliot Whitfield, who was watching her with those patient eyes, and she understood with complete clarity what was being offered. Not money, not comfort, a door. This door, here, right now. Walk through it and all of this goes away. Thank you for stopping by, she said. She picked up her goods and walked out. She heard nothing behind her. No anger, no threat. Just silence, which was somehow worse because it meant he'd expected this and had already moved on to whatever came next. Grace walked back toward the ranch in the last of the evening light, her boots in the mud, her package in her arms, thinking hard. Caleb was getting better. The Whitfields knew it. Whatever they'd planned for a dead man and an orphan boy was going to have to change now, and men like Elliot Whitfield didn't change plans. They just revised the method. The easy version of this was over. She walked faster. She walked home with her package and the cold settling in around her, and she didn't tell Caleb about the conversation with Elliot that night. She told herself it was because he was still recovering and didn't need the weight of it. That was true. It was also true that she wasn't ready to say out loud what she'd felt standing in that mercantile, looking at Elliot Whitfield's patient face. That particular cold clarity of understanding that the man across from you is not going to stop. She put the groceries away. She made supper. Owen ate 2 full portions of the bean stew she'd made, which she was taking as a personal victory because when she'd arrived, he'd been eating like a bird. Small, careful amounts, like a child who'd learned not to expect much from a plate. Caleb ate sitting up in bed, which was new. 3 weeks ago, she'd had to prop him up with both pillows and her own arm. Now he managed it on his own, slowly, with the focused effort of a man relearning things he'd done without thinking his whole life. You're quiet, Caleb said when she collected his bowl. I'm tired, she said. He looked at her for a moment. He had a habit of doing that, watching her with those dark eyes in a way that felt like he was cataloging something. Not unpleasantly, just carefully, like a man who'd been surprised before and was trying to understand what he was seeing before he decided what to make of it. Elliot come by? He said. Grace stopped. How did you know? Because you went to town and came back looking like you'd walked through something cold and were still carrying it. He set his hands on the blanket. What did he say? She told him. All of it, straight, the way she'd learned he preferred. Caleb listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd noticed about him. He didn't jump into a conversation while someone was still talking. He waited, took it in, then spoke. He'll move to the lawyers next, Caleb said when she finished. He's been working up to it. Elliot doesn't do anything without a plan, and the plan was always, wait for me to die, take Owen through the courts, take the land through the debts. Now that I'm not dying on schedule, he stopped. His mouth went flat. He'll look for another angle. What angle? Grace said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He'll try to say the marriage isn't valid, that I was too far gone when I made the decision to be considered sound. He met her eyes. He's not wrong that I was sick. He'll argue I wasn't in my right mind. Were you? Grace said. Caleb almost smiled. I was the clearest I'd been in a week. Funny how knowing you're running out of time focuses a man. He paused. Dr. Hale knows that. Fry knows that. The question is whether Elliot can find a lawyer who'll make the argument stick in front of a judge. Can he? Caleb looked at the ceiling. He's got money enough to find lawyers. That's not the same as winning, but it's enough to make things difficult. He looked back at her. Grace, I need you to understand something. I'm going to be on my feet in a few weeks, but between now and then, I'm not able to... He stopped. There was something frustrated in his face, something that had been there since the beginning and that she was starting to understand. Wasn't anger at her, but at the situation, at being the kind of man who could not stand up and handle the thing that needed handling. I hate this, he said, lying here while you're the one walking into town and facing Elliot across a counter. I'm not fragile, Grace said. I know you're not. His voice had an edge to it, not at her, at himself. That's not what I mean. I hate that you have to. I hate that I put you in this. Grace looked at him. This man who had asked a stranger to marry him on his deathbed and was now, against all expectation, lying in his own bed recovering, having to be angry at his own body for not working faster. You didn't put me in anything, she said. I walked in on my own 2 feet. I know, he said. Stop apologizing for surviving, she said. That landed somewhere in his face that she couldn't fully read. He turned his head and looked at the wall for a moment. When he looked back, something had shifted slightly. Loosened, maybe. All right, he said quietly. Owen appeared in the doorway with the expression he used when he'd been listening to adult conversations and wasn't sure whether to admit it. Is Elliot Whitfield going to try to take me away? He said. Both adults were quiet for a beat. No, Caleb said. His voice was completely certain, which Grace recognized as a choice, not a fact. He's not. Owen looked at his father, then at Grace. He had the kind of face that processed things carefully, that didn't take reassurance at face value. How do you know? Owen said. Caleb held the boy's gaze. Because your mother is the most stubborn woman I have met in my life, and Elliot Whitfield has never dealt with anything like her. It was the first time he'd called her that. Neither of them had been paying attention to what they'd said until it was already said. Owen looked at Grace. Grace felt something move through her that she didn't have a ready name for. Go to bed, she said to the boy, and her voice came out a little rough, which she covered by picking up Caleb's water pitcher and taking it to refill. Owen went to bed. The house was quiet after that, and Grace stood at the kitchen basin filling the pitcher with her back to the room, and she stood there a moment longer than necessary before she went back. Caleb was on his feet by the end of the 4th week. Not steady feet, not working feet. He was using the chair back as a crutch, and his face went white around the mouth when he stood too long, but he was vertical, and for a man who 3 weeks ago couldn't lift his own head, vertical was significant. Dr. Hale came by and looked at the leg and made a sound that was as close to amazed as a professional man allowed himself to be. You'll have the scar, the doctor said. I know, Caleb said. You'll need to take it slow. The muscle's going to take time. Don't try the full ranch on day 1. He won't? Grace said from the doorway. Caleb gave her a look that was not entirely friendly. She gave him one back that was entirely unbothered. Dr. Hale watched this exchange and seemed to file it away. Listen to her, Hale said to Caleb and left. The first time Caleb made it out to the porch on his own, Grace was in the side yard beating a rug that had needed it for 2 months. She heard the door open and looked up and saw him standing there, one hand on the porch post, looking out at the yard with something on his face that she thought was probably complicated to feel. A man who nearly died, standing in the daylight of his own property, looking at a woman he'd been married to for a month who he still barely knew, who had beaten the dust out of every rug in his house and replanted his kitchen garden and was currently dusty from the effort. She went back to beating the rug. That needed doing months ago, he said. I'm aware, she said. He came and sat on the porch steps, which was probably as far as he was going on that first outing, and he watched her work. She didn't mind being watched while she worked. She was used to it. The fence on the east pasture, he said after a while. 3 posts down. I know, I put it on the list. I can look at it tomorrow. You can look at it from here tomorrow, she said. By next week you can walk out to it. By the week after you can fix it. He was quiet. You're going to manage my recovery whether I like it or not, he said. I already have been, she said. You're just now noticing because you can walk. He was quiet again. Then, with the particular tone of a man making an admission, the east fence, it's worse than 3 posts. I didn't want to tell Hale the full situation because he'd have me on my back another 2 weeks. Grace paused the rug. How bad? The whole northeast corner. He rubbed the back of his neck. I was going to fix it in November. Then the accident happened. She looked at him. What do you need? Wire, posts, 2 days' work. He looked at his hands. I'm not going to be 2 days' work capable for another few weeks. And if the fence stays down, the cattle drift. We lose cattle, we lose income. Grace thought. Who in Larkin would you hire for that work? Couple of men. Sam Pruitt, if he's not already working somewhere. Tom Akers. He paused. It'll cost. How much? He told her. It was more than she'd expected, but not ruinous. Do it, she said. That's my money, he said in a tone that was half statement and half question, like he wasn't entirely sure what the rules were anymore. It's our money, Grace said. She went back to the rug. Unless you want to tell me, I should have kept separate accounts before we married, in which case, your timing is terrible. She heard him exhale, something between a laugh and an exhalation of frustration, and underneath both of those, something that might have been relief. Sam Pruitt, he said. I'll send Owen with a note tomorrow. Good, she said. The letter from the Whitfield's lawyer arrived on a Monday. Grace recognized what it was before she opened it because of the quality of the envelope. Heavy paper, the kind that cost money, the kind that said, "We can afford this and you cannot." She opened it at the kitchen table while Owen was outside and Caleb was working his way through breakfast at the normal table for the first time, which had been its own small victory that morning. She read it once, set it down, read it again. "What is it?" Caleb said. She handed it across. He read it. His face didn't change much, but his jaw went hard in the way she was beginning to know meant he was working through something bad quietly. "They're petitioning to have the marriage annulled," he said, flat, stating a fact. "On what grounds?" "Incapacity." He set the letter down. "They're arguing I was incapacitated by illness when the ceremony took place and therefore wasn't legally able to consent." He looked at the paper. "They've got an affidavit from a doctor." "Hale?" "No." He picked the letter up again. "Someone named Carr. I don't know him." "A doctor who's never examined you and is willing to swear you were incapacitated," Grace said. "A doctor Elliot found and paid and put a pen in front of." Caleb folded the letter. His hands were steady. "Fry needs to see this today." Owen was coming in from outside. He stopped in the doorway, reading the table the way children read rooms, the set of the adults' faces, the particular quality of silence. And Grace watched him process it. "Is it Whitfield?" Owen said. "Yes," Caleb said. He didn't soften it. Grace had noticed he didn't do that with Owen. Didn't wrap things in cotton the way some parents did, which she thought was probably both a strength and something the boy had paid for. "What do they want?" "To say our marriage isn't real," Caleb said. Owen was quiet for a moment. "Is it real?" Caleb looked at Grace across the table. "Yes," he said. Owen looked at Grace. "Yes," she said. Owen sat down in his chair and picked up his fork. "Then tell them that," he said. Grace looked at the 7-year-old boy, this child who had lived with loss and uncertainty long enough that his response to a lawyer's letter was then tell them that, and she felt something fierce and protective move through her that had nothing to do with any arrangement or duty or circumstance. "That's exactly what we're going to do," she said. Fry read the letter 3 times, which was his version of alarm. He set it on his desk, picked it up, set it down again. Grace and Caleb sat across from him, Caleb with his cane, not ideal, but necessary still, and Grace with her hands folded and her face neutral. "Dr. Carr is from Casper," Fry said. "He has no connection to Larkin. He never examined Caleb. How an affidavit from him stands up is—" He pushed his spectacles up. "It shouldn't stand up. But if we're in front of the wrong judge, or if Elliot has done any preliminary work with the circuit—" "Has he?" Caleb said. "I don't know yet." Fry tapped the letter. "What I do know is that we need to respond before this gets to a hearing, and our response needs to be airtight." He looked at them both. "Hale's testimony is essential. I'll need a formal statement from him, and Reverend Aldous, I'll need the same, both attesting to Caleb's state of mind during the ceremony." "They'll do it," Caleb said. "They'll need to do it in writing first and in person if it reaches a courtroom." Fry took his spectacles off and set them on the desk. "I also think we need character witnesses, people in Larkin who've seen this marriage in practice, who can speak to the fact that this is a functioning household, that Owen is being cared for." He looked at Grace. "That you are, in every meaningful sense, this family." Grace thought of the rug she'd beaten, the fence posts she'd noted on her list, the suppers, the mornings, the nights she'd spent in the hallway chair listening for Caleb's breathing. "Who would do that?" she asked. "More people than you might think," Fry said. He almost smiled, which was rare. "Small towns talk, Mrs. Thornton. The same talk that made the first weeks uncomfortable is now working in your favor. People have seen what you've done here." Grace hadn't known that. She'd had her head down, focused on the next thing and the thing after that, not watching how the town was watching her. "All right," Caleb said. "What do you need from us?" "Time," Fry said, "and patience. Elliot's going to push fast, so we push back carefully." He picked up the letter one more time. "One more thing. The affidavit they're using. I want to challenge Dr. Carr's credentials directly. If he's willing to sign this, he's done it before. That kind of thing leaves a trail." "You think you can find it?" Grace said. "I think a lawyer who puts his name on fraudulent testimony for money is not a careful man," Fry said. "Careful men don't do it. Careless ones make mistakes." He finally permitted himself the small, tight smile. "And careless men's mistakes are a great comfort to the careful." Sam Pruitt and Tom Akers fixed the northeast fence in a day and a half, which was better than Caleb had estimated. Caleb went out to look at it on the second day, walking the full distance on his own for the first time, and Grace watched him from the window as he stood at the fence row talking to Pruitt about the post holes and the wire gauge and whether the ground was soft enough still to reset the corner post properly. She could see, even from that distance, the difference in him. The way he stood with the cane, but not on it, not leaning. The way he used his hands when he talked. He was coming back. She turned from the window and went to the stove. Owen came in from school that afternoon. Grace had enrolled him the second week because whatever else was uncertain, a child needed school. And dropped his books on the table with the particular controlled chaos of a boy who'd been sitting still all day and was done with it. Mrs. Alderman says we're reading a history of the territory next month, he said. Good, Grace said. She also asked me if my mother helped me with my arithmetic. Grace turned from the stove. What did you say? Owen shrugged. I said yes. He picked up his books and stacked them neatly. Because you did. Grace looked at the boy for a moment. Do you mind? She said. That she called me that? Owen thought about it. He had the habit of actually thinking before he answered, which was either something he'd been born with or something loss had taught him. No, he said. He paused. Do you mind? No, Grace said. Owen nodded, satisfied. I went to get an apple from the bowl on the counter, and the subject was closed with the particular finality that children can manage. The question asked, the answer received, no further discussion required. Caleb came in an hour later, moving slower, his leg having had its limit for the day. He sat down heavily at the table and accepted the coffee Grace put in front of him without comment, which was how she knew he was tired. When he was doing reasonably well, he said thank you. Pruitt did good work, he said. I'll tell him you said so next time I'm in town. Caleb wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He was looking at the table. I want to talk to you about something. Grace sat down across from him. The ranch, he said. What it needs. What I can do and when. He looked up. I've been keeping that in my head and not telling you, and it's not fair to you. You're managing this household, and you deserve to know what you're managing. She hadn't expected that. She waited. He told her. All of it. The state of the cattle, what he'd lost in the accident and what remained, the notes he owed at the bank, the grazing rights situation on the north acreage that had a complicated history with a neighboring landowner named Briggs, the realistic income from the current herd size, what it would take to rebuild it. He talked for 20 minutes, which was more than he'd said at once since he could stand up, and she listened the way he listened, without interrupting, taking it in. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. It's not as bad as I thought, she said finally. It's not good. It's manageable, she said. The notes at the bank, when are they due? February, both of them. Then we have time to plan, she thought. What's the north acreage issue with Briggs? Dispute. He claims my father's fence encroached 6 feet into his property. My father said it didn't. Nobody ever settled it officially. Does it affect the grazing rights? If Briggs pushes it to court, it could affect the rights on about 30 acres. He looked at her. You're taking notes in your head right now. I always am, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Caleb Thornton didn't smile easily, she'd learned, but there was something there. Where did you come from? He said. The question wasn't what it sounded like on the surface. She understood that. It was the version of the question that meant, how is it that you are the way you are, and what do I do with that? Cheyenne, she said. Before that, a farm in Missouri that went to debt. Before that, she stopped. Before that is a long story for another time. He nodded, didn't push. They sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and the sound of Owen in the next room doing arithmetic, and it was, Grace thought, the most ordinary thing she'd experienced in years. Just 2 people at a table in a house that smelled like supper and wood smoke, trying to figure out how to keep the pieces together. It was not a small thing. The second letter from the Whitfield's lawyer came 3 weeks after the first, and it was worse. Fry came to the ranch to deliver it himself, which told Grace everything before she'd read a word. He sat at the kitchen table, Caleb across from him, Grace beside Caleb. Owen sent out deliberately, and he laid the letter flat and put both hands on the table and said, "They've moved to a custody petition." Caleb was very still. "They're no longer only challenging the marriage," Fry said. "They're going directly after Owen. Separate track. They're arguing that regardless of the marriage's validity, Owen's maternal grandparents have a stronger claim to his welfare than a man who nearly died and a woman he married 4 weeks ago." "That's not how custody law works," Caleb said. No, Fry said carefully, but it's how a judge can interpret it if the Whitfields can demonstrate that Harold and Elliot are financially superior and that the Thornton household is unstable. He folded the letter. They've also petitioned to have a county official make a welfare visit to the ranch to assess Owen's living situation. Grace looked at Fry. When? The petition says within 30 days, given that the circuit judge is currently in Casper, and given that the Whitfield's lawyer has an office in Casper. Fry left the implication hanging. It could come faster, Grace said. It could. Caleb put both hands flat on the table. They cannot take him. No, Fry said, but we need to make that case clearly enough that a county official comes out here, looks at this house and this family, and goes back and writes a report that leaves no room for interpretation. He looked between them. I want to be direct with you both. This is not just about paperwork anymore. This is about what a person sees when they walk through that door. The home, the child, the relationship between all three of you. Grace sat with that. She thought about what a county official would see if they walked through that door. The house that had gone from neglected to functional over the past month. The meals, the swept floors, the repaired fence, Owen with his school books and his chickens and his apple after school. She thought about Caleb, still using a cane, still not full strength, the scar on his leg that Dr. Hale said would always pull a little when it was cold. She thought about herself, a woman who'd arrived from Cheyenne with $43 and a suitcase held shut with a belt. What do we need to do? She said. Fry looked at her. Keep doing exactly what you're doing and let me do the legal work. He paused. There's one more thing. The affidavit from Dr. Carr. I wrote to the medical board in Casper about him. He allowed himself a small, careful pause. He's been disciplined once before for falsifying records in a divorce proceeding. It wasn't enough to cost him his license, but it's documented. Caleb's eyes sharpened. Can you use that? Grace said. In front of a judge? Fry nodded slowly. Yes, it won't destroy Carr, but it will damage his credibility substantially. And a witness whose credibility is damaged is a witness the other side needs to distance themselves from. He picked up the letter. It means Elliot's lead argument for annulment gets weaker, which means he needs the custody petition to succeed on its own, which means the welfare visit becomes everything. They sat with that for a moment. The welfare visit, Caleb said. We can't control when it comes. No, Fry said, but you can control what they find when it does. The night after Fry left, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room off the main bedroom, the arrangement they'd kept because it was practical and because neither of them had pushed for something different, and because practical was what they were. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about county officials and custody petitions and the particular helplessness of knowing that your life could be altered by a stranger's 30-minute visit. She heard Caleb moving in the next room. The soft sound of him getting up, which she'd learned was slower than it used to be, a careful, deliberate process that the leg required. She heard him go to the kitchen, the sound of the water pitcher. She got up. He was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of water, looking out at the dark yard. He didn't turn around when she came in, but he didn't startle either, which meant he'd heard her. Can't sleep, he said. No, she said. She got herself water and stood near the table, not next to him, just in the same room, in the quiet, which was somehow better than lying separately in the dark. I've been thinking, he said, about Owen, about what I've given him. He didn't look away from the window. A dead mother, a father who nearly died, a legal battle that's going to follow him into whatever comes next. His voice was flat, but the flatness was doing work. And you, a woman who came here for a housekeeping job and ended up, he gestured vaguely at the room, the house, all of it. Stop, Grace said. I'm not being self-pitying, he said. I'm being accurate. You're being accurate about the bad parts and leaving out the rest, she said, which is the same as being inaccurate. He turned and looked at her. Owen has a home, she said. He has school. Has his chickens, which he takes more seriously than most men take their work, and that's going to serve him well in life. She set down her cup. And he has a father who fought for him from a sickbed, which is not a small thing. Children remember what their parents fight for. Caleb was quiet. What do you want, he said. Not from this situation. From your life, when this is settled. Whatever you wanted before Fry's letter found you in Cheyenne. It was the most personal thing he'd asked her. She looked at the window he'd been looking out of, at the dark yard, at the shapes of the trees against the sky. I wanted to stop moving, she said. I'd been moving for 3 years. Different towns, different work. She paused. I wanted something that held still. He was quiet for a long time. This land isn't going anywhere, he said finally. Whatever the Whitfields think. I know, she said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a speech. It was just 2 tired people standing in a kitchen in the dark, saying the things they'd been carrying, setting them down somewhere safe enough to leave them. Grace picked up her cup and rinsed it at the basin. Get some sleep, she said. Your leg needs it. My leg is fine, he said, which was not entirely true, but she let it go. She went back to her room. She lay down. Outside, the Wyoming night was very quiet, which was one of the things she'd come to notice about this place. The particular depth of its quiet, nothing like Cheyenne, nothing like Missouri. Just land and dark, and somewhere across the yard, 3 chickens that Owen had named and argued with daily and watched over like they were his personal responsibility. She closed her eyes. She was asleep in minutes. The county official came on a Tuesday, earlier than the 30-day window Fry had cited, and he came without advance notice, which was either policy or deliberate, and Grace didn't have time to decide which, before she was opening the front door to a thin man in a good coat with a leather satchel and the look of someone who had performed this particular task many times and had strong feelings about not being made to feel anything about it. His name was Mercer. He showed his papers. He said he was here to conduct a welfare assessment of the minor child, Owen Thornton. Grace said, "Come in, I've just made coffee." She watched Mercer take in the front room as he walked through it. She watched him the way she'd watched the room when she first arrived, cataloging. The swept floor, the table that had books on it, Owen's school things, the stove that was lit and the smell of something reasonable cooking, the curtain she'd mended 2 weeks ago, not new, but presentable. Owen was at the table doing his reading. He looked up when Mercer came in, assessed the situation with those gray eyes, and went back to his book with the particular composure of a child who had learned that adults came and went, and the best strategy was to be exactly what you were. Mercer asked questions for 40 minutes. About the household, about Owen's routine, about Caleb's health and recovery, about Grace's background, which she answered straight. Missouri, Cheyenne, the circumstances of her arrival in Larkin, the marriage. She didn't dress it up. She said it plain. At one point, Mercer asked to speak to Owen alone, and Grace took the coffee to the kitchen and stood at the window while Caleb, who'd been on the porch and come in when he heard the knock, stood beside her, and they both looked at the yard and did not talk. "He's fine," Caleb said quietly. "About Owen." "I know," Grace said. When Mercer came back to the kitchen, he had his notebook open and he wrote something in it, and then he asked Caleb some questions about the ranch's financial situation, which Caleb answered with the same directness Grace had, not making it better than it was, just true. Mercer closed his notebook. He put his pen away. He looked around the kitchen one more time, at the stove and the swept floor and the braided rug Grace had put down because the floorboards in that corner were cold and Owen's feet were small. "Thank you for your time," he said. "Mr. Mercer," Grace said. He looked at her. "Owen's been through a great deal," she said. "He's a remarkable child. Whatever you write in that report, make sure it reflects what's actually in this room." Mercer looked at her for a moment. His face was professionally neutral, but he nodded once, with something in it that was slightly more than professional. He left. Caleb let out a breath that had been held too long. Owen came out of the front room, stood in the kitchen doorway, and said, "Was that the man from the Whitfields?" "He was from the county," Grace said, "not from the Whitfields." "What did he decide?" "We don't know yet," Caleb said. Owen looked between them. Hy had the stick from the first day in his hand. He'd kept it, Grace had noticed, kept it and carried it sometimes without seeming to notice he was doing it, the way people keep small things that were present at important moments. "I told him I like it here," Owen said. Grace and Caleb both looked at him. "He asked me if I was happy," Owen said, matter of fact. "I said yes. I told him I like my chickens and I like my school and I like having supper every night with people who don't look at me like I'm a problem." He considered the stick. "I told him the truth. That's what you're supposed to do." Grace felt her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." Owen went back to his reading. Caleb put his coffee cup down on the counter carefully and stood there for a moment with his head slightly lowered, and Grace looked at the window, and the house held still around the three of them, the way she'd wanted something to hold still for 3 years. Not perfect, not easy, not anything like what she'd expected, but still. Mercer's report came back in 11 days. Fry brought it to the ranch on a Friday afternoon, arriving on horseback in the kind of cold that had started settling into the Wyoming landscape in earnest. The air sharp and dry, the sky a particular pale gray that meant the season was turning for real. Grace saw him coming from the kitchen window and had coffee on the table by the time he knocked. He sat down, opened his satchel, and put the report on the table without preamble. "Read the last paragraph first," he said. Grace picked it up. Caleb read over her shoulder. The last paragraph of Mercer's official report stated, in the careful language of a county official who had learned to say things without quite committing to them, that the Thornton household presented as a stable and functioning domestic environment, that the minor child, Owen Thornton, appeared well-nourished, well-supervised, and emotionally adjusted to his current living situation, and that there was no evidence of neglect or circumstance warranting intervention. Grace set the report down. "That's good," Caleb said. "It's very good," Fry said. "It's not a complete win. The Whitfield's lawyer will argue it's one man's opinion from one visit, but it substantially weakens the welfare petition. A judge who reads this and then reads the Whitfield's argument is going to have a harder time justifying removal." He took off his spectacles and cleaned them. "Combined with the car affidavit problem, I think we're in a better position than we were 2 weeks ago." "What's their next move?" Grace said. Fry put his spectacles back on. "That's what I want to talk about, because I've been doing some digging, beyond the car situation. And I found something I think you need to know." Both of them looked at him. Fry folded his hands on the table. He had the manner of a man who was about to say something he'd been thinking about carefully for a while, choosing his order. "Harold Whitfield," he said, "Owen's grandfather. I've been looking at the Whitfield holdings, land records, liens, tax filings. What I found is that the operation is considerably more leveraged than anyone in this county knows. Harold borrowed heavily 3 years ago against the eastern acreage, and again last year against the cattle stock. The note on the eastern land is due in the spring." He paused. "A significant note." Caleb was very still. "How significant?" "Enough that selling this land and the water rights that come with it would make a meaningful difference to Harold's position." Fry looked at him directly. This was never only about Owen. It was always also about the water. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The Thornton land sat above a natural spring-fed creek that ran year-round. Grace had noticed it on her second week, the creek that crossed the northeast corner of the property, the one that didn't dry up in August the way the surrounding land did. She'd noted it as a practical asset, the reason the cattle did reasonably well even in dry years. She hadn't thought about what it meant to a neighbor who was in debt. "The Whitfields need our water," Grace said. "They need access to it," Fry said. "Badly enough that this whole campaign, the marriage challenge, the custody petition, the welfare visit, it's all been aimed at acquiring either the land outright or leverage sufficient to force a sale." He looked between them. "Which means that Elliot Whitfield is not operating from strength. He's operating from pressure. His father's financial situation is pushing him." Caleb absorbed this. "Does Harold know what Elliot's been doing?" "That's the question I can't answer," Fry said. "Elliot runs the daily operations. He's old and he's unwell from what I hear. I don't know how much of this he's authorized directly and how much Elliot is doing on his own initiative." He paused. "It matters, because if Harold knew the full picture of what Elliot's done, the fraudulent affidavit, the petition, he might not be pleased. Harold Whitfield built his reputation on being a hard man, but not a dishonest one." Grace thought of what Caleb had told her about Eliza, that she'd fought her own family over this marriage, that Harold had loved her in his way. "Harold lost his daughter," Grace said, "and now Elliot is dragging her son through a custody fight to cover a debt." Fry nodded slowly. "That's the shape of it." Caleb pushed back from the table. He stood, fully upright, only slightly favoring the leg now, and walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room. "Can we use any of this?" Grace asked Fry. "The financial records are public. I can put them in front of a judge." Fry gathered his papers. "Whether it's enough to end this outright, I don't know. The Whitfields will have responses. They always do." He stood. "But knowing why a man is doing something is useful. It tells you what he needs and what he'll trade to get it." After Fry left, the kitchen was quiet for a long time. Grace refilled her own coffee and sat at the table and waited, because she'd learned that Caleb needed time to process things without being pressed, and that when he was ready, he'd say what he was thinking. He turned around from the window. "I need to talk to Harold," he said. Grace looked at him. "Not Elliot," he said. "Harold." "Caleb, Elliot's running this for his own reasons. You heard Fry. If Harold is sick and doesn't have full picture of what's being done in his family's name..." He stopped. "Eliza was his daughter. Owen is his grandson. If there's any part of Harold Whitfield that is the man Eliza believed he was, he may not be that man anymore," Grace said. "He may not," Caleb agreed. "But I need to find out." He met her eyes. "Because if there's a way to end this that doesn't go through a courtroom, that doesn't put Owen on a witness stand, that's what I want." Grace thought about it for a long moment. "What would you offer him?" she said. "Access to the creek," Caleb said. "A water rights agreement. Formal, legal, properly drawn up. He gets what he needs for the Eastern operation. We keep the land and Owen stays here." He paused. "It's not a concession. It's a negotiation. The land is worth more than the water if I can keep them separate. And if Harold says no, or if Elliot finds out and gets there first, then we go to court," Caleb said. "But we try this first." Grace looked at her husband, this man who was standing on a healing leg in a kitchen that had been neglected when she arrived, who had nearly died 3 months ago, and was now talking about negotiation strategy with the clarity and steadiness of someone who had decided exactly how much he was willing to bend and exactly where the line was. "When?" she said. "This week," he said, "before Elliot moves again." I went alone. Grace argued against this, not loudly, but directly, and Caleb listened and then said he needed to go alone because Harold Whitfield was not going to speak plainly in front of a woman he'd never met, and that was simply how it was. And Grace heard the truth in this, even though she didn't like it. He took the horse. He was riding again, not long distances, not hard, but enough. She watched him go from the porch with Owen beside her, the boy's shoulder warm against her arm. "He'll be fine," Owen said. "I know," Grace said. "He always comes back," Owen said, and the way he said it, not quite certain enough to be certain, the word always doing the work of hope rather than fact, told her exactly what the boy had been living with since his mother died. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Let's go feed those chickens," she said. Caleb came back in the late afternoon, and Grace could read something in his face before he'd dismounted. Not defeat and not victory. Something more complicated, something that needed to sit down and have coffee before it could be said properly. She poured the coffee. Owen was doing his reading at the table. Caleb sat down, put both hands around the cup, and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment. "Harold's sick," he said. "Worse than Fry knew. He was in bed when I arrived." He paused. "Elliot tried to turn me away at the door. I told him I was there to speak to his father about a family matter and that Harold could decide for himself whether he wanted to receive me." "Elliot let you in," Grace said. "He didn't want to. But turning away your dead daughter's husband when your father is upstairs in a house with servants who talk, he made the calculation." Caleb drank his coffee. "Harold looks old. More than I expected. He's maybe still sharp, but he's diminished, physically." He set the cup down. "He cried when I came in, just for a moment when he first saw me. He asked about Owen and I told him Owen was fine. I told him Owen was doing well in school." Grace watched Caleb's face. "Did you make the offer?" she said. "I did." Caleb looked at the window. He listened, all of it. The water rights arrangement, the terms I had in mind. He paused. He said he knew about the annulment petition, but that he hadn't authorized the custody fight. He said Elliot handles the legal work and he trusts him to do it right. His voice went flat. He said he trusts Elliot. "But," Grace said, but his hands shook when he said it. Caleb looked at her. Not from age, from something else. He let that sit for a moment. He said he'd consider the offer and talk to his lawyer. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no, which is more than Elliot would have given me. And Elliot, Grace said, was in the room for the last 5 minutes. Harold had a servant fetch him. Caleb's jaw tightened. He stood there and listened, and his face didn't move. When Harold said he'd consider it, Elliot said, "I'll review any proposal with our legal counsel," and looked at me in that way he has. "The patient way," Grace said. "Yes." Caleb's mouth compressed, but there was something else in it this time, something that wasn't as patient as usual. He looked at his coffee cup. He knows his position is weaker than it was. Whatever Fry's been filing, it's being felt. Owen had been quiet throughout this, the way he was quiet when he was listening carefully and not wanting to be sent out of the room. Grace had noticed he'd stopped pretending not to listen a couple weeks ago, had just accepted that he was going to be present for things, and that she and Caleb had tacitly accepted it too. "Did my grandfather ask about me?" Owen said. Caleb looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "He asked what you like to do." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you had 3 chickens you were raising, and that you were top of your class in arithmetic." Owen considered this. "Is that true? About arithmetic?" "Mrs. Alderman told me last week," Grace said. Owen looked genuinely surprised. Then he went back to his book, but there was something different in his posture. A small thing, like a door that had been cracked open just slightly. That night, after Owen was in bed, Grace sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote down everything she knew about the Whitfield situation. The debt, the water rights, the car affidavit, Mercer's report, Fry's assessment. She made 2 columns, what they had, what they still needed. It was a habit from the farm in Missouri, from her mother, who had said that a problem written down is half a problem solved, which was an exaggeration, but not entirely wrong. Caleb came in and looked at the paper and sat down across from her. "You do this with everything?" he said. "When I need to think," she said. He reached across and turned the paper so he could read it. He looked at it for a while. "The Briggs dispute," he said. He pointed at the left column where she'd written it. "Still on the list," she said. "I talked to Briggs last month. He's not interested in pushing it to court. He just wanted it acknowledged." Caleb took the pencil from her hand and drew a line through it. It was such an ordinary gesture, reaching across and taking her pencil and crossing something off her list, that she sat with it for a moment after. "That helps the North Acreage," she said. "It does." He handed the pencil back. He looked at the right column. "What we still need? Fry thinks the car thing is enough to kill the annulment petition?" "He thinks so. He's not certain." "Nothing in this is certain," Caleb said. "No," Grace agreed. He was quiet. He looked at the paper and then at the window and then back at the paper. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it straight." "I always do," she said. "Do you want this?" His eyes came up and met hers. Not the situation, not managing it, this. His gesture was minimal. The table, the house, all of it. When it's settled, when the Whitfields are dealt with one way or another. "Do you want to be here?" It was the question she'd been carrying since the morning she'd come back upstairs and told him she'd do it. The question she hadn't let herself answer directly, because there had always been something more immediate to manage. She looked at her list, at the 2 columns of what they had and what they needed. "I've fixed this kitchen," she said. "I've fixed the pantry and the rugs and the garden, and I've learned which boards in the hallway creak, and I've learned that Owen won't eat parsnips no matter how you prepare them." She looked at him. "I've spent 3 months building something. I don't walk away from things I've built." Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. Same word he'd said that first week, the same weight in it, but different now. Fuller. "All right," she said. The hearing date came from Fry on a Wednesday. The circuit judge would be in Larkin in 3 weeks' time, and the Whitfield's petition would be heard. Both the annulment challenge and the custody matter, consolidated into one proceeding. Fry had pushed for the consolidation. It was better, he said, to settle everything at once in front of one judge than to fight on 2 fronts separately. The 3 weeks were the most difficult of the whole stretch, not because anything dramatic happened, but because waiting is its own kind of hard. The ordinary days continued. Grace cooked, Owen went to school, Caleb worked the ranch in increasing capacities, adding another hour of physical labor each week as his strength came back. But underneath everything was the knowledge of the date, the way it sat at the back of every conversation. Fry came by twice to prepare them. He walked Caleb and Grace through what to expect, what the Whitfield's lawyer would argue, how a judge would likely approach the testimony. He told Grace she would probably be asked questions about her background, her finances, her reasons for accepting Caleb's proposal. He told her to be honest and direct and not to anticipate the questions before they were asked. "What will they try to make me look like?" Grace asked him. Fry was honest. An opportunist, a woman who saw a vulnerable man and a piece of land and made a calculated move. Grace sat with that. "That's not what happened," she said. "I know," Fry said. "The question is whether we can make a judge see it clearly enough." He paused. "The character witnesses will help. I've spoken to several people in Larkin who've agreed to provide written statements. Mrs. Alderman from the school, Sam Pruitt, 2 other families who know the Thornton property. He looked at Grace. People talk in this town. Not all of what they've said has worked in your favor, but the balance has shifted. Because of the welfare report, Caleb said. Because of what the welfare report confirmed, Fry said. What people were already seeing. The night before the hearing, Grace couldn't sleep again. It was becoming a pattern. The nights before the hard days, the ceiling at 2 a.m, the particular weight of the dark. She got up and went to the kitchen and sat at the table with nothing in front of her, just her hands and the quiet. She heard Caleb's door, heard him come down the hall. He came into the kitchen and looked at her sitting there and didn't say anything, just went and poured himself water and sat across from her. They sat in silence for a while. "I've been thinking about Eliza," he said eventually. Grace looked at him. I'm not... He stopped, started more carefully. "She would have liked you," he said. "She was practical. She didn't respect people who weren't." He turned his cup in his hands. "She would have said something sharp about this whole situation. Something that made you laugh even when you didn't want to." Grace didn't say anything. She understood she wasn't supposed to say anything, that he was just setting something down and didn't need it responded to. "I didn't talk about her enough after she died," he said. "Owen doesn't have enough of her. I kept it all," he gestured at his chest, "in here, where it didn't do anyone any good." "You were grieving," Grace said. "I was, and then I was sick." He looked at the table. "And then you were here, and things started working again, and I told myself there'd be time later. There's always supposed to be time later." "There's time now," Grace said. He looked at her. "Tell me about her," Grace said. "Tell me what Owen should know." So he did. He talked for a long time about Eliza, who had grown up on the Whitfield ranch with all its money and had chosen a working cowboy anyway because she'd said she didn't want to live a life where everything was already decided. Who had laughed loudly and argued about everything and loved Owen from the moment he existed with a ferocity that had sometimes frightened even her. Who had been sick for 6 weeks and fought the whole time and died on a Tuesday morning in February when the snow was still on the ground. Grace listened to all of it. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. He looked, she thought, slightly lighter, not better. Grief doesn't get better, it just gets more familiar. But lighter, the way a person looks when they've been holding something alone for a long time and finally put it down in the presence of another person. "Owen should know that," she said. "What you just told me. He should have that." Caleb nodded slowly. "I know." "Not all at once," Grace said. "But you should start." "I know," he said again, and this time it sounded like a real commitment. The morning of the hearing was cold and bright. A Wyoming November morning with the sun doing its work without warmth, the kind of day that looked warmer than it was. Grace dressed carefully in her second dress, which had become her good dress by default, and helped Owen with his collar while Caleb hitched the wagon, and they drove into Larkin with the particular quietness of people heading towards something they'd prepared for as thoroughly as possible and now just had to live through. The hearing was held in the town hall, which was the largest interior space in Larkin, and still too small for what had gathered there. Grace had not expected the people. She'd understood abstractly that Fry had spoken to witnesses, that there were written statements, that people in the town had been paying attention. But she hadn't expected to walk into that room and see it. The aldermans in the second row, Sam Pruitt near the back, Hattie Morris from the dry goods store who Grace had spoken to maybe 4 times in 3 months, the Devereaux family from the neighboring homestead who she'd met once. People who had gathered not because they were required to, but because they'd decided this mattered. She sat at the table beside Caleb and felt, for the first time since she'd arrived in Larkin, that the town was something she was part of and not something she was moving through. The Whitfields came in on the opposite side. Elliot, composed and well-dressed, with 2 lawyers in suits that cost more than anything in the room. Harold was not present, which told its own story. Either he was too ill or Elliot had decided not to bring him, and Grace couldn't tell which was worse for them. The judge was a compact man named Hargrove, gray-bearded and deliberate, who settled into his chair at the front of the room and looked at both tables with the expression of a man who had seen enough frontier courthouse disputes to have very little patience for anything that wasted his time. Fry opened for their side. He was concise and clear, the way he was at his best. No performance, no excess, just the essential facts laid in order. The marriage had taken place with Caleb's full cognizance and under the witness of both a physician and a man of ceremony. The petition for annulment rested on the testimony of one Dr. Carr of Casper, who had never examined the patient. Dr. Carr had on a previous occasion provided false testimony in a legal proceeding, a matter of record with the medical board. Fry put the medical board document on the judge's table and stepped back. The Whitfield's lawyer, a smooth man named Galloway with the kind of voice that had been trained to sound reasonable, argued that Caleb's physical state at the time of the wedding had been documented by the Casper physician as likely to impair judgment. Fry responded that a physician who had never been in the room could document nothing about a specific patient's state, and that the word likely was doing heavy lifting in a legal document. Hargrove asked questions, sharp ones. He wanted to know the source of Carr's information, which turned out to be a conversation with Elliot Whitfield. He asked, with the particular tone of a man who already suspected the answer, whether Dr. Carr had reviewed any medical records from Dr. Hale. He had not. Hargrove looked at Galloway for a long moment. "Proceed," he said, in a tone that did not sound like a compliment. Dr. Hale testified. He was a careful, precise man who did not exaggerate in either direction. He said Caleb Thornton had been critically ill. He said he had been feverish. He said with equal precision that during the ceremony he had been present and observant, that he had answered questions put to him clearly, that he had shown no confusion about the nature of the proceedings or the decision he was making. He said the marriage had taken place during a moment of genuine, if painful, clarity. Galloway tried to challenge this. Hale responded to every question with the same methodical accuracy. He was not rattled. He was simply correct. Then Fry put Grace on the stand. She sat in the chair and looked at the room, at Caleb at the table, at Owen beside him, at the people gathered in rows, at Hargrove behind his desk. And she was very calm. She had expected to be frightened, and she wasn't. She was tired, and she was ready, and she realized, exactly as prepared as she could be. Fry asked her to describe the circumstances of her arrival in Larkin. She told it plainly. The letter from Fry, the stage north from Cheyenne, the boy on the steps, the room upstairs, the offer Caleb had made, and the reason she'd accepted. "Did you accept Mr. Thornton's proposal for financial gain?" Fry asked. "I accepted it because there was a child who was about to lose his last protection," Grace said. "The financial arrangement was secondary. It was also, as it turned out, irrelevant, since he didn't die." There was a small sound in the room. Not laughter exactly. Something close. Hargrove's expression shifted by about 4 degrees, which Grace suspected was significant for him. Galloway cross-examined her. He was skilled. She gave him that. He asked about her finances before Larkin, her employment history, the fact that she'd agreed to the marriage within a day of meeting Caleb. He framed each question to suggest a pattern of calculation. "Isn't it true," Galloway said, "that you stood to inherit land and money in the event of Mr. Thornton's death?" "That was part of the arrangement he offered, yes," Grace said, "and you agreed to this arrangement very quickly after less than 24 hours. "I did." "Why?" Grace looked at him. "Because the boy needed someone to say yes, and no one else was going to." Galloway paused. He'd expected something he could work with. He shifted. "Mrs. Thornton, you had no prior connection to this family, this town, or this territory. Isn't it reasonable to say that your attachment to the child, your claim that this is genuine and not calculated, is difficult to verify?" "Talk to Owen," Grace said. Galloway blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You want to know whether my attachment to Owen is genuine," Grace said. "Talk to him. He's 7 years old. He knows who looks at him like he matters." Hargrove was looking at her steadily now. Galloway moved on. When Grace stepped down and returned to her chair, Caleb looked at her. He didn't say anything, but the look was enough. Owen was called next, which Fry had arranged carefully and Galloway had not tried to block, because blocking a child's testimony looked badly. Owen walked to the front of the room with his hands in his pockets and sat in the chair and looked at Judge Hargrove with the gray eyes that didn't miss anything. Hargrove leaned forward slightly. "Owen, I'm going to ask you some questions. You just tell me what's true, all right?" "All right," Owen said. "Do you know why you're here today?" "Because the Whitfields want me to live with them," Owen said, "and my pa and Grace don't want that." "What do you want?" Owen was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, because he was, Grace had learned, a child who took the weight of questions seriously. "I want to stay home," he said. "What makes the Thornton Ranch home to you?" Hargrove said. Owen thought about it. "My chickens are there," he said, "and my pa and Grace." He looked at his hands. "And my ma's things are there. Pa kept all her things. Her rocking chair is still in the front room." He looked up. "Nowhere else has that." The room was very quiet. Hargrove sat back. He looked at his papers. He looked at both tables. He looked at the people gathered in the rows behind. "I'll have a ruling before end of day," he said. They waited in Fry's Mercantile. Fry made tea and Grace drank it without tasting it, and Owen fell asleep on the bench in the back corner because he was 7 and exhaustion will always catch a child, eventually regardless of the circumstances. Caleb sat in a chair near the window and watched the street. Elliot Whitfield walked past outside at one point. He didn't look in. "He knows," Caleb said quietly. "Knows what?" Grace said. "Which way it's going." Caleb's eyes followed Elliot until he was out of sight. A man like that always knows. Fry came back from the town hall at 4 in the afternoon. He came in through the door and stood for a moment, and his face, which Grace had learned to read in its smallest movements, was holding something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite victory, but was on that side of the line. "Hargrove ruled against the Whitfields on both petitions," Fry said. "The annulment is denied. The custody petition is dismissed." He set his satchel on the counter. He cited Dr. Carr's credibility in his written notes. He cited Mercer's welfare report. He cited Dr. Hale's testimony. Fry paused. And he cited Owen. Caleb put his hand over his face for a moment. Just a moment. Grace sat very still. "It's done," she said. "This round," Fry said carefully, "the Whitfields could theoretically appeal. But an appeal costs money they're already short of, and it would require new grounds, which they don't have." He looked at them both. "I think it's done." Owen woke up from the bench in the corner. He looked at the 3 adults and read the room the way he always did. "Did we win?" he said. Caleb crossed the room and put his hand on his son's head, the way a man does when words are insufficient. "Yeah," Caleb said. "We did." Owen leaned against his father's side. He looked at Grace over his father's arm with his gray eyes that held everything he'd seen and everything he carried and everything, now that he didn't have to be afraid of anymore. "Good," Owen said. And that was the whole of it, in that one word from a 7-year-old boy who had learned not to expect much and was, slowly, unlearning it. The whole of what the past months had been, the marriage made from desperation and the house rebuilt from nothing and the fight conducted one careful step at a time. All of it had aimed at this room, this moment, this child leaning against his father in the back of a mercantile in Larkin, Wyoming, saying good with the full weight of what good meant when it had not always been available. Grace stood up. She walked to the window Caleb had been watching the street from. Outside, Larkin went about its late afternoon business. The wagon, the livery, the busted shutter still banging on the saloon. The same ordinary town it had always been. She thought about the letter she'd received in Cheyenne. The $43, the suitcase with the broken latch, the boy with the stick on the mercantile steps. She thought, one thing at a time, which was what she'd told herself on the worst night, when the fever was at its peak and she was cooling Caleb down with wet cloths in the dark. One thing at a time had gotten them here. She turned from the window. Caleb was watching her. He did that. She'd come to understand it as something particular to him, the way he paid attention to her as a habit rather than a performance. Owen was pulling on Caleb's sleeve about something, the way children do the moment the crisis passes, already moving toward the next ordinary thing. She walked back to where they were. That was enough for today. The ride home from Larkin that evening was quiet in the way that things are quiet after a long strain finally releases, not empty, but full of something that doesn't need to be spoken. Owen sat between them on the wagon bench with his shoulder pressed against Grace's arm, and for the first stretch of road he was awake and watching the landscape go by in the last of the light, and then he was asleep, tilted against her, his weight solid and trusting. Caleb drove. Grace sat with the boy's weight against her side and looked at the road ahead and felt cautiously the unfamiliar sensation of something being over. Not everything. She knew better than that. Fry had said this round with deliberate care, and she'd heard the care in it. But this round, at least, was done. "You were good in there today," Caleb said. He was looking at the road. "I told the truth," Grace said. "Most people can't tell the truth under that kind of pressure without it coming out wrong," he said. "You didn't." She thought about Galloway with his smooth voice and his framed questions. She thought about what it had felt like to sit in that chair and understand that the story of the last 3 months, everything she'd done, every decision, all of it, was being reduced to a question of motive, whether she'd come here for the land, whether she'd stayed for calculation. "It made me angry," she said. "That's what kept me steady. I was too angry to be frightened." Caleb glanced at her. "Angry at Galloway?" "At the idea of it," she said, "that you can look at a person's choices and decide they meant something different than what they meant." She shifted Owen slightly so his head was more comfortable. "I know why I did what I did. I don't need a lawyer to tell me it was something else." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Harold wasn't there," he said. "I noticed. Elliot made that decision." He kept his eyes on the road. Harold's sicker than we knew. I keep thinking about what Fry said, that Harold didn't authorize the custody fight. If he'd known what Elliot was doing in his name. He stopped. It doesn't matter now. It might matter later, Grace said. He glanced at her again. You think Elliot comes back? I think Elliot doesn't stop wanting the water, she said. What changes is how he pursues it. He can't use the courts again, not on these grounds, but a man with that kind of pressure on him finds other ways. She paused. Your offer to Harold still stands? If Harold wants it, Caleb said. A water rights agreement is better for both of us than a fight. It's better for Owen. Then let Harold come to you, Grace said. Don't approach Elliot. Don't make another trip out there. Wait. She adjusted her arm around the sleeping boy. If Harold's the man you think he might still be, he'll reach out. If he's not, then we know that too. Caleb nodded slowly. The wagon moved through the dark, the horse knowing the road, the night around them full of the particular Wyoming silence that Grace had come to recognize as its own kind of company. Grace, Caleb said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. Not performative, not a speech, just the two words carrying everything he meant them to carry. She looked back at the road. You're welcome, she said. They rode the rest of the way home without talking, and it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had said the necessary things and didn't need to fill the space after. The days following the hearing had a different texture to them. Not easier, exactly. The ranch still needed the work it had always needed. The winter was coming on hard, and there was enough to do from first light to last that ease wasn't really the word. But there was a quality to the ordinary days that hadn't been there before, like the difference between walking on ground that might give way and walking on ground that you know will hold. Caleb worked the ranch with increasing capability. By the second week after the hearing, he had stopped using the cane except in the mornings, when the cold made the healing muscle in his leg seize up until it loosened. He was out before Grace most mornings now, which she hadn't expected and which seemed to matter to him in a way she understood without it needing to be explained. A man who had spent months dependent, getting back to what he knew himself to be. She let him. She had her own work. The kitchen garden, which she'd planted late in the season as an act of pure stubbornness, had given them more than she'd expected. Not enough to be comfortable, but enough to mean something. She'd put up preserves in October, lining them on the shelf in the cellar, and every time she went down there and saw them, she felt something that was close to satisfaction, the particular kind that comes from making something out of not much. Owen continued with school and continued with his chickens and continued with his arithmetic, which Mrs. Alderman had confirmed in writing, for the character file Fry was keeping was genuinely excellent. He had also, in the weeks since the hearing, begun to talk more. Not dramatically. Owen didn't do anything dramatically, but there was more of him present in the evenings, more conversation at the supper table, more questions. He asked Caleb about the cattle. He asked Grace about Missouri. He asked about Eliza, sometimes, and Grace had watched Caleb learn to answer those questions without closing up, the way she'd asked him to. It wasn't smooth. Caleb would get halfway through a memory and sometimes have to stop, and Owen would wait and then they'd continue or they wouldn't, and both of those were okay. Grief doesn't resolve. It just becomes part of the furniture, something you learn to move around rather than trip over. One evening in late November, Owen came to Grace while she was mending by the stove and asked, without looking at her directly, if she had any photographs of his mother. No, Grace said. I never knew your mother. I know, Owen said. He picked at the edge of the table. Pa has some, but he keeps them in his room. He paused. I don't want to ask him. Grace set down her mending. Why not? Owen shrugged, the kind of shrug that means the exact opposite of I don't know. He won't say no, Grace said carefully. You know that. He gets that face, Owen said. When I ask about her, he tries to hide it, but I see it. Grace thought about this. Come with me, she said. She took Owen to Caleb's room, knocked first, received the answer, went in, and stood in the doorway with Owen beside her and said, Owen wants to see the photographs of his mother. I told him he should ask you directly. Caleb looked at his son. Owen looked at the floor. I should have brought them out long ago, Caleb said. His voice was quiet. I went to the chest at the foot of his bed and opened it and brought out a small wooden box that Grace hadn't seen before. They sat on the bed, all three of them, which was not something they'd done before. And Caleb opened the box and took out the photographs one by one. There were 4. Eliza, at maybe 20, before Owen, looking directly at the camera with a look on her face that Grace could see immediately was a family trait. Eliza and Caleb outside the ranch house squinting into summer sun, Caleb's arm around her, both of them younger than Grace had known either of them. Eliza with newborn Owen looking completely exhausted and completely certain. And one more, Eliza alone sitting in the rocking chair that was still in the front room, reading. Owen held each one. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. "She's pretty," he said finally. "Yes," Caleb said. "I look like her some," Owen said. It wasn't a question. "Around the eyes," Caleb said, "and the way you go quiet when you're thinking." Owen looked at the photograph of Eliza in the rocking chair. He ran his thumb along the edge of it. "Can I put this one in my room?" "It's yours," Caleb said. Owen took the photograph and left the room carefully, the way he moved when he was carrying something important. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the remaining 3 photographs in the box. Grace stood near the door. "He needed that a long time ago," she said. Not an accusation, just true. "I know," Caleb said. He put the box back. Then he sat for a moment on the edge of the bed with his hands on his knees, looking at the floor, and Grace left him to it and went back to her mending. The letter from Harold Whitfield arrived on a Thursday, written in a hand that was clearly effortful. The letters uneven, pressing hard on the page in the way of someone who had once had a strong hand and was now compensating for what they'd lost. It was addressed to Caleb, but written in a way that felt like it was meant for both of them. It was not long. Harold wrote that he had been informed of the judge's ruling and wished to convey that the decision had not surprised him. He wrote that he had spoken at length with his son Elliot about the nature of the legal proceedings and the methods that had been employed, and that he had made his position clear. He wrote, and this was the part that made Caleb read it twice, that he considered the matter of the marriage and custody to be settled, and that he would not be party to any further legal action against the Thornton household. Then he wrote a single paragraph about Owen, that he hoped Owen was well, that Eliza would have been, and here the word was crossed out and rewritten, would have wanted him to say that the Whitfield family bore the boy no ill will, and that he, Harold, remained his grandfather and would welcome correspondence if the boy was ever inclined. He did not mention Elliot's name again after the second paragraph. He did not mention the water. He signed it simply Harold Whitfield with no title. Caleb handed it to Grace. She read it. She handed it back. "He reined Elliot in," Caleb said. "Or tried to," Grace said. "What do you mean?" She chose her words. "Harold is sick. He's old. He can tell Elliot his position, but..." She looked at the letter. "How long does Harold's position hold after Harold is gone?" Caleb hadn't thought that far ahead. She could see him thinking it now. "The water rights offer," she said. "I think you should still make it, formally. Put it in writing through Fry. A legal agreement that predates whatever comes after Harold." She paused. "If Elliot signs it, he's bound by it. If he doesn't, then at least we know." Why would Elliot sign anything that benefits us? "Because without it, the eastern acreage stays dry in a bad year, and he knows it," Grace said. "Elliot is practical. He's ruthless, but he's practical. A formal water rights agreement is less than what he wanted, but more than nothing, and nothing is what he has right now." Caleb looked at the letter again. "You want me to negotiate with a man who tried to take my son?" "I want you to protect your son from that man ever having cause to try again," Grace said, "which means removing the thing he wants as a motive." It was a hard thing to hear, and she knew it, and she didn't soften it. Caleb sat with it for a while. He got up and walked to the window, the habit he had when he was working through something difficult, putting the physical distance between himself and the table. "I hate that you're right," he said finally. "I know," Grace said. He turned around. "I'll talk to Fry tomorrow." Fry drafted the water rights proposal over the following week, and Caleb reviewed it twice, and Grace reviewed it once, and asked 3 questions that sent Fry back to his desk to clarify 2 clauses. Fry seemed to find this more amusing than irritating, which Grace took as a good sign about the quality of her questions. The proposal went to the Whitfield ranch by courier on a Monday. They waited. While they waited, the first real snow came. It came overnight, the way Wyoming snow did. Serious from the start, not a dusting, but an intention. Grace woke to the particular silence of a snow morning, that total absorption of sound, and looked out the window at a world that had rearranged itself white. Owen was already up. She could hear him in the kitchen, which was unusual enough that she got up to investigate. He was trying to make oatmeal. The pot was on the stove. The fire was lit. He'd done that correctly. And he was standing on his toes, stirring with a spoon that was too large for him, his face set with the concentration he applied to arithmetic. "You didn't wake me," Grace said. "You were sleeping," he said, as if this were a complete explanation. She came and stood beside him and looked at the pot. How much oats did you put in? Owen looked at the pot with an expression that suggested the ratio might be wrong. I think maybe too many, he said. She took the spoon and assessed the situation. It was, in fact, quite thick. We'll call it porridge, she said. More substantial. Owen relaxed visibly. Is that bad? No, Grace said. Thick oatmeal is just oatmeal that means business. She handed the spoon back. Keep stirring, I'll get the salt. They made breakfast together in the snowy quiet, the three of them eventually, Caleb coming in from checking the stock, stomping snow from his boots, accepting coffee with both hands. And the kitchen was warm and close, and outside the snow kept falling, and this was, Grace thought, the simplest version of what they'd been working toward. Not perfect. Owen spilled his milk and looked mortified. Caleb burned his tongue on the coffee and said something under his breath that he then glanced at Owen about, and Owen pretended not to have heard with considerable skill. The oatmeal was genuinely too thick, but it was theirs. All of it, the spill and the burned tongue and the too thick oatmeal, it was theirs, and nobody was going to take it. Elliot Whitfield's response to the water rights proposal came not by letter but in person, and not in the way anyone expected. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, alone. No lawyers, no men behind him, riding a good horse and wearing his good coat, and he knocked on the front door like a man making a visit rather than a threat. Grace answered it because Caleb was out back with the cattle and she'd heard the horse. She looked at Elliot Whitfield on her porch. He looked at her. Mrs. Thornton, he said, is Caleb available? He'll be in shortly, she said. Do you want to come in and wait? He paused. Surprised, she thought, that she'd offered. Yes, he said. Thank you. She brought him into the kitchen, which was not the formal room, but was the real room, the one that was actually lived in, and she poured coffee without asking whether he wanted it because it was cold and he'd ridden out, and refusing hospitality to someone who has come to your house in good faith, regardless of history, was not how she'd been raised. She set the cup in front of him and sat across the table and waited. Elliot looked around the kitchen. She let him look. My father's declining, he said. He said it without preamble, which surprised her enough that she stayed very still. Faster now. The doctor says spring is optimistic. I'm sorry, Grace said, and she meant it in the complicated way that it was possible to mean something for a man you'd never met and wouldn't like if you had. Elliot wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was such an ordinary gesture, so similar to the way Caleb held a cup when he was tired, that it was briefly startling. He wants to see Owen, he said. Before he stopped, he asked me to come and ask. Not demand, not arrange through lawyers. Just ask. Grace looked at him. He told you to ask me? She said. He told me to ask Caleb. Something moved in Elliot's face. I'm asking you because you're the one who'll decide how this goes. I've understood that for a while. She sat with that for a moment. What about the water rights proposal, she said. I'll sign it, Elliot said. The terms are reasonable. He didn't say fairer than I deserve, but she heard the shape of it. I should have... He stopped again. He was a man, she was learning in this single conversation, who had been taught never to leave a sentence unfinished because unfinished sentences were weakness, and was now finding that certain sentences could not be finished without becoming something he wasn't ready to be. The proposal is reasonable, he said again. I'll sign. Grace heard the front door, Caleb coming in, stamping snow. He came through to the kitchen and stopped when he saw Elliot at his table. The two men looked at each other across the kitchen. Grace watched. She did not intervene. Elliot, Caleb said. His voice was flat, not hostile. Caleb, Elliot said. You wrote out yourself, Caleb said. I did. Caleb came and poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter rather than sitting, which put him at a slight height advantage that Grace suspected was not entirely unintentional. Your father? Caleb said. He wants to see Owen. Elliot met Caleb's eyes directly. It's what he's asked for. He hasn't asked for much. Caleb looked at his coffee. The kitchen was very quiet. And after Harold's gone, Caleb said, What then? From you. I'll sign the water rights agreement, Elliot said, and I'll leave you alone. He said the last part with a kind of flatness that was not indifference, but something more like exhaustion. I've spent 6 months and more money than I want to count on something that I convinced myself was right, and he stopped, set down his cup. I want the Eastern operation to run. That's what I want. The rest of this, he shook his head. My father's dying, Caleb. He's dying, and the last thing he said to me before I rode out here was that Eliza would have been ashamed of me. He said it straight, without flinching, which Grace thought was probably the hardest thing she'd watched a man do in a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb set his coffee cup down. "Does Harold want to come here?" he said. "Or does he want Owen to come there?" "He can't travel," Elliot said. "Not in this weather, not in his condition." Caleb looked at Grace. She didn't tell him what to decide. This was his. Owen was his son, and Harold was his dead wife's father, and the full weight of that history belonged to Caleb. "Let me talk to Owen," Caleb said. Elliot nodded. "Stay for dinner," Caleb said. It was not warm. It was not unfriendly. It was the offer a man makes to another man in his house in winter, because certain things are simply how you do it, regardless of what's passed between you. Elliot looked mildly stunned. He paused. "Thank you," he said. Caleb took Owen out to the barn for the conversation, which Grace understood. Some things needed to be said away from the house. In a space that was a little rougher and more honest, she made dinner. She heard the barn door, heard them go in, heard the particular silence of the yard in the snow. Elliot sat in the front room. Grace could hear him not moving, the particular stillness of a man left alone with himself. She made biscuits because she had the flour and it was cold, and biscuits were something you could make with your hands and not have to think too hard about. When Owen and Caleb came back in, Owen looked at Elliot in the front room with the careful gray eyes. "You're my uncle," Owen said. Not a greeting, not an accusation, a statement of fact being tested. "I am," Elliot said. "You tried to take me away," Owen said. The room was very still. "Yes," Elliot said. He didn't qualify it, didn't explain it. Grace thought that was probably the best choice he could have made. Owen looked at him for a long moment. "Pa said grandfather is sick," he said. "He is," Elliot said. "Pa said I can decide," Owen said. "That's right," Elliot said. Owen looked at his father. Caleb's face was careful and present and entirely without direction, which Grace could see was costing him something. "I'll go see him," Owen said. "Once, and Pa comes with me." "Of course," Elliot said. Owen nodded. Then he went to wash his hands for dinner, because it was time for dinner and he was hungry, and the conversation was apparently done in the way that Owen ended conversations, completely, without residue, having said the necessary thing and moved on. Elliot watched him go. When Owen was out of the room, something in Elliot's face shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to be visible. I didn't say anything. Grace didn't ask him to. She put dinner on the table. They went to the Whitfield ranch on a Saturday, Caleb and Owen in the wagon. Grace did not go, and she and Caleb had talked about this the night before. Not an argument, but a careful conversation about what Harold was owed and what the visit was for, and whether Grace's presence would serve Owen or complicate things that didn't need to be complicated. "Harold's never met you," Caleb said. "He's dying and he wants to see Owen. This trip is for Owen." "I know," Grace said. "You're not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not leaving you out of this family. I want that said plain." "I know that too," she said. "Go. Take your son to see his grandfather. Bring him home." They left in the morning. Grace watched the wagon go down the road and then went inside and cleaned the kitchen, which didn't need cleaning, and reorganized the cellar, which needed it marginally more, and wrote a letter to no one in particular that she folded and put in the stove. Some letters are just for getting the words out of you. They came back in the late afternoon. Owen was quiet in a particular way, not sad, not upset, just full. The way a person is when they've experienced something that needs time to settle. Caleb came into the kitchen while Owen went to check on his chickens, the daylight routine that never changed regardless of what else happened. "How was it?" Grace said. Caleb sat down. He looked his age and then a little more. "Harold cried when he saw Owen," he said. "Just sat there in his bed and looked at him and cried. Didn't even try to hide it." Grace sat down across from him. "Owen handled it well," Caleb said. "He sat with him. He told him about the chickens." His mouth turned up slightly. Went on about the chickens for about 10 minutes. "Of course he did," Grace said. Harold laughed. Caleb looked at the table. "First time I've seen Harold Whitfield laugh since before Eliza died." He was quiet for a moment. "He asked about you." Grace looked up. "He asked if you were good to Owen," Caleb said. "I told him, yes." He said, Caleb paused, working over the words. "He said Eliza would have chosen someone like you, not to flatter, just—" He shook his head. "Harold's not a man who flatters. He said it the way he says things. Straight." Grace sat with that. "Elliot was there," she said. "Elliot was there. He stayed out of the way." Caleb turned his cup in his hands. He watched Owen with Harold, and he watched it with this face. He stopped. I don't know what he was feeling. I don't know if I want to know, but he didn't interfere and he didn't make it about himself. Maybe he's learning something, Grace said. Maybe, Caleb said. Or maybe he's calculating something different. He looked at her. I don't trust him. You don't have to trust him, she said. You just have to have an agreement he can't easily break. She paused. Did he say anything about the water rights? Fry's drawing up the final papers, Caleb said. Elliot will sign next week. Grace nodded. Owen came in from outside, smelling of cold and chicken and the outdoors, and went directly to the stove to warm his hands. Grandfather gave me something, he said. He opened his hand. It was a small carved horse, worn smooth with handling, the kind of thing that had clearly lived in someone's pocket for a long time. What did he say when he gave it to you? Caleb said. Owen turned the carving over in his fingers. He said it was his when he was my age. He said his father gave it to him. He looked at it. He said I should keep it safe. Then you keep it safe, Caleb said. Owen put the carving in his own pocket. He went and got an apple from the bowl and sat at the table and opened his school book, because it was Monday tomorrow and he had a reading to do. Grace looked at the three of them, at this kitchen that had been empty and neglected and was now full of suppers and spilled milk and arithmetic and a boy with a carved horse in his pocket. And she thought about a merchant's letter she'd received in Cheyenne, addressed to a woman with $43 and a broken suitcase and no particular reason to go north. She thought about Owen on the mercantile steps with his stick, drawing lines in the dirt. She thought about how close it had all been, the whole thing, the entire improbable architecture of it. How many ways it could have gone differently. A letter that arrived a day later, a fever that didn't break, a judge who saw things differently, a small boy who, when asked if he was happy, had said yes, with the particular weight of someone reporting a true thing. She got up and started on dinner. Owen, she said, set the table. I know, he said, without looking up from his book. Then do it, she said. He got up and got the plates, and Caleb watched him with the look he had sometimes that Grace had come to read as something between gratitude and wonder and the quiet, specific pain of a man who had come very close to losing everything he loved and still hadn't fully absorbed the fact that he hadn't. She put the pot on the stove. Outside, the snow had started again, light this time, more like a reminder than a declaration. The kind of snow that said, winter's here, but it isn't angry about it. Through the window, she could see it drifting past in the last of the light, settling on the yard, on the fence that Sam Pruitt had fixed, on the small hen house where 3 chickens were, at this moment, being more or less managed by a 7-year-old boy who took that responsibility entirely seriously. The biscuits from yesterday? Caleb said. Any left? Some, Grace said. They were good, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a speech. It was just Caleb Thornton telling the truth in the smallest way, which was how he did everything. I know, she said, and that was enough for that evening in that kitchen with the snow coming down outside and the table being set and the pot heating on the stove, and all of them still here, still whole, still building the ordinary days that turn out, in the end, to be the whole of it. Elliot signed the water rights agreement on a Tuesday in Fry's Mercantile, with Caleb across the table and Fry beside him and no ceremony about it. He read every clause. Fry had expected this and didn't rush him. And then he signed his name in the careful hand of a man who understood what he was putting his name to. When it was done, he capped the pen and set it on the table and stood and extended his hand to Caleb. Caleb looked at the hand for a moment. Then he shook it, brief and firm, the way men settle things that are settled. Elliot left without staying for coffee. Grace, who had waited outside with Owen rather than participate in something that didn't need her in the room, watched him ride out and felt the particular closure of watching a threat leave the frame. Not a reformed man necessarily, not a transformed one. Just a man who had run into something harder than himself and had finally, under the pressure of his father's dying and his own limits, chosen the practical path. She could live with that. Practical was enough. You didn't need people to become good. You needed them to stop doing harm, and that was a different and more achievable thing. Done, she said when Caleb came out. Done, he said. Owen looked between them. Really done, Caleb said. Owen considered this for a moment, then went back to examining something in the dirt near the mercantile steps. An old habit, the stick long since worn down and replaced by whatever was nearest to hand. Some things stay in a person regardless of what changes around them. Fry appeared in the doorway. I'll file the agreement with the county by end of week, he said. Once it's registered, it's binding on both parties and their successors. If Elliot ever tried to revisit it, he'd be in breach, Caleb said. Substantially, Fry said. He permitted himself a small, satisfied nod. I think we can say the matter is concluded. Grace looked at Fry, this small, anxious man with his spectacles and his nervous polishing, who had started this whole thing by writing a letter to a woman in Cheyenne and who had, through careful and stubborn work, helped them come out the other side of it. Thank you, Aldous, she said. Fry looked slightly surprised. She had never used his first name before. It was good work, he said. Then, because he was Fry and sentiment made him uncomfortable, the filing fee is $3. Harold Whitfield died in January. The news came by way of a brief note from Elliot, written in the same effortful hand as Harold's letter had been, which made Grace wonder if the difficulty of handwriting was something that ran in that family, or if Elliot's hand was simply not used to writing things without a lawyer's language in them. The note said only that Harold had passed on the 14th, that the burial would be private at the ranch, and that Harold had asked for Owen to have a second item, a small silver pocket watch that had been his own father's, which was being sent separately. The watch arrived 3 days later, wrapped in cloth in a small box. Owen opened it at the kitchen table. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. It still works, he said. He opened the case and listened to it. I can hear it ticking. Wind it every morning, Caleb said. Don't let it run down. Owen closed the case carefully. He set it beside the carved horse, which had lived on his nightstand since the day Harold gave it to him. He looked at the two objects together for a moment. I only met him twice, he said. I know, Caleb said. He seemed like he used to be more than he was when I met him, Owen said. It was the way a child says something that an adult would spend 10 sentences on, directly, without dressing it up, like he was the smaller version of who he'd been. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That happens to people, he said. Doesn't mean the bigger version wasn't real. Owen nodded, processing this. Then, do you think he was sorry for what Elliot did? Caleb looked at his son. I think he was, he said. I think he was sorry for more than that. Owen picked up the watch. Okay, he said. And that was the whole of his morning for Harold Whitfield. Not cold, not indifferent, just the contained and practical grief of a boy who had already learned what genuine loss felt like and knew the difference between that and this. He put the watch in his pocket and went to do his reading. Grace cleared the table. Caleb sat for a moment longer, looking at the window. You all right? She said. I'm thinking about Eliza, he said. She'd have wanted Owen to know him. Harold before everything went sideways. He turned his cup in his hands. She left home because her family was too much, but she never stopped loving her father. She couldn't live inside what he'd built. Owen will understand that when he's older, Grace said. I know. Caleb looked at the table. I'm going to tell him. When he's old enough to hear it clearly. He paused. All of it. What his mother gave up to have this life, and why she thought it was worth it. Good, Grace said. She went back to the stove. Outside, the snow was still on the ground, hard-packed now, the kind that would stay until March. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was hot, and somewhere in the front room, Owen was settling into his chair with his reading, and the house held all of them the way a house does when it has been properly inhabited, when it knows the weight of its people. Spring came the way spring does in Wyoming, reluctantly and then all at once. The snow went from something permanent to something retreating overnight, and suddenly there was mud everywhere, and the cattle were restless, and the kitchen garden needed turning, and the northeast fence that Sam Pruitt had fixed in the fall required a second look after the hard winter. Caleb went over the fence himself this time. Grace watched him from the kitchen window on the morning he walked out to do it, striding across the thawed ground, no cane, no favoring of the leg, just a man walking his land at full capacity. The scar on his leg would always pull in the cold, Dr. Hale had said. There were mornings still when she heard him moving slowly before he loosened up. But in the spring sun on his own land, going to look at his own fence, he moved like himself. The version of himself that had been returning in increments all winter, piece by piece reassembled. She turned from the window and went back to the bread she was making. She thought, not for the first time, about the nature of what she'd built here. Not what she'd been given. Built. Because that was a thing that was true and that nobody said plainly. The life they had now was not something that had happened to them. It had been constructed deliberately in the small choices of 100 ordinary days. The morning she'd come back upstairs and said, I'll do it. The night she'd kept Caleb cool with wet cloths in the dark. The afternoon, she'd looked at Elliot Whitfield across a mercantile counter and picked up her goods and walked out. The conversation with Owen about his mother's photograph. The biscuits that were too thick, and the oatmeal that was too thick, and the time Owen spilled his milk and looked at her for her reaction before he knew how he felt about it himself. None of it was dramatic, none of it was a single turning point, it was accumulation. Daily choices compounding into something that held weight. She had been $43 and a broken suitcase and no particular reason to go north. She was something different now, and the difference was not a gift, it was work. Hers and Caleb's and Owen's, each of them doing the daily labor of being present to something that didn't have to exist. She punched down the bread dough and thought, that is the thing nobody tells you. That the life you want is not a thing you find. It is a thing you make, and making it is ordinary and unglamorous and takes longer than you think it should. And some mornings you are not certain it is working, and then one morning you look up from the bread dough and out the window at a man walking his land in the spring sun, and you understand that it is. Owen turned 8 in April, and Grace made a cake. Not an elaborate one. She was not a woman who made elaborate cakes, and Owen was not a boy who required elaborate things. It was a plain butter cake with the last of the winter preserves spread on top, and it was slightly lopsided because the oven ran hot on one side and she hadn't fully corrected for it, and it was, by any reasonable measure, a good cake. Owen looked at it with the seriousness he applied to things that mattered. "How old are you in this one?" he asked, meaning the preserve. "Peaches from September," Grace said. "So about 7 months." He nodded, satisfied. "Peach is my favorite." "I know it is," she said. They ate it at the table, the 3 of them, and Caleb had 2 pieces which he did not comment on, but which Grace noted as an endorsement. And Owen ate his slice and then asked with studied casualness whether there might be more, and she cut him more. After dinner, Owen went out to his chickens. There were 5 now. The original 3 plus 2 he'd acquired through a trade at school that Grace had never gotten the full story on. And Caleb helped Grace clear the table, which was something he'd started doing in February without comment, just picking up plates and bringing them to the basin, and she'd accepted it without comment too, because that was how they did things. "He's doing well," Caleb said. About Owen. "He is," Grace said. "Mrs. Alderman told me he's the best reader in his class now," Caleb said. "She told me in town last week. I forgot to tell you." Grace looked at him. "You forgot to tell me that?" "I was thinking about the north pasture and I forgot," he said. He didn't look apologetic, just matter of fact, which was Caleb. "I'm telling you now." "Best reader," Grace said. "By a fair distance," she said. Grace turned back to the basin. She was smiling in a way she didn't want to perform, so she kept her face toward the window. Outside, she could hear Owen talking to the chickens, the ongoing instructional monologue that he maintained with complete conviction, undiscouraged by the chickens' consistent failure to improve their behavior. "Grace," Caleb said. She turned. He was standing with his hands at his sides, not holding anything, not doing anything with them, which was unusual for him. Caleb was a man who was always doing something with his hands. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want to say it right, which means I need you to not respond for a minute until I've finished." She looked at him. "All right," she said. He looked at the floor briefly, the way he did when he was organizing himself, then looked back at her. "When I asked you to marry me," he said, "I was asking you to do something for Owen. That was the whole of it. I didn't know you. I didn't think past the 3 days I thought I had." He paused. "And then I didn't die and things changed, and I've spent the better part of a year watching you." He stopped, started again. "Watching you build something that I didn't believe was possible to build. In this house and with Owen and..." Another stop. "I had a wife I loved. I know what it is to love someone. And I didn't think. I told myself I wasn't going to." He shook his head slightly. "I was wrong about that." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm not asking you for anything different than what we have," he said. "I'm not asking you to feel what you don't feel. But I needed to say it because you are the most honest person I know, and it seemed dishonest not to." He looked at her directly. "I love you. That's what I'm saying. I didn't expect to, and it doesn't require anything from you, and that's the whole of it." Grace stood at the basin with her hands still in the dishwater. She thought about a merchant's letter in Cheyenne, a suitcase with a broken latch, a boy on the mercantile steps with a stick, a man in a bed who was supposed to be dying, watching her from across the room with dark eyes that were already taking stock. She thought about every version of "I'm not going anywhere" she'd said or meant over the past year. The middle of the night kitchen, the county official's visit, the hearing, the bread dough this morning, the cake, the window, the man walking his land in the spring sun. She thought, I know exactly when it happened. It happened in pieces, the way everything real does, slowly and then all at once. She took her hands out of the dishwater and dried them on her apron. Caleb, she said, you don't have to, he started. I said you'd be quiet while you talked, she said. Now it's my turn. He stopped. I came here for $43 and a reason to stop moving, she said. That was true. I didn't come here for you. I didn't come here for Owen. I didn't come here for anything complicated. She looked at him. And then it got complicated and I didn't leave, and I told myself that was stubbornness or practicality or the kitchen investment I wasn't willing to walk away from. She paused. I wasn't being honest with myself, which, as you said, is a problem for me, given how I feel about honesty. Something moved in his face. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I've said it before, and it was true before, and it's more true now, and what makes it more true is... She stopped, said it simply. You, and Owen, and this. She gestured at the kitchen, the house, all of it, the same way he had on the night she'd said no particular answer was required. I didn't come here for love, but I'm not going to pretend I haven't found it. Caleb stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and put his arms around her, and she let him, and stood there in the kitchen with her hands still slightly damp, and the preserve cake on the counter, and Owen outside arguing with a chicken about something, and she thought, this is not what I expected my life to look like. She thought, good. The summer that followed was the hardest working summer Grace had experienced since the Missouri farm. And unlike the Missouri farm, this one was building towards something rather than away from it. The herd grew. Caleb hired one hand permanently, a quiet young man named Fisher who slept in the small room off the barn and worked without complaint, and ate whatever Grace put in front of him with visible appreciation, which she considered an excellent quality in a person. Owen spent the summer split between helping on the ranch and conducting what he described as experiments with the chickens, which as far as Grace could determine were not experiments in any scientific sense, but were rather attempts to determine the precise limits of a chicken's decision-making capacity. The chickens were not improving, but Owen remained undiscouraged. He also, that summer, started writing letters to Elliot Whitfield. This was Owen's own idea, and he mentioned it to Grace one evening as though it were a perfectly ordinary thing, which in his mind, it clearly was. He'd decided, he said, that Elliot was his uncle whether he liked it or not, and that family was something you kept track of even when they'd done wrong, and that writing a letter was different from forgiving a person and didn't require forgiving them first. Grace had looked at this 8-year-old boy and had thought, not for the first time, that he was going to be a formidable person when he was grown. "What did your father say?" she asked. "He said it was my choice," Owen said. "And what did he say when you were done deciding?" Owen almost smiled. He said to tell Elliot that the northeast fence is solid and the water's running well. Elliot wrote back. Brief, careful letters that revealed nothing personal and relayed nothing dramatic, just the ordinary news of a ranch operation. The eastern herd's numbers, the condition of the acreage, a brief remark about the spring having been wet. But they came, and they kept coming, and Owen filed them in a box in his room alongside the photograph of Eliza in the rocking chair and the carved horse and the pocket watch. Grace had not expected to feel anything about Elliot Whitfield's letters. She found she felt something cautious and not entirely unwelcome. Not warmth, not trust, just the faint possibility that a person who had done real harm could still, given enough time and reason, choose differently. She had seen it once. She was willing to hold the possibility that it could continue. She did not tell Caleb this because he was less willing to hold it, and she respected that. A man whose son had nearly been taken carries that in a specific part of himself that takes longer to quiet than other parts. She could wait. She was good at waiting. September came, and Owen started another school year, and Grace turned her attention to the kitchen garden for the last time before the frost. And on a particular evening in the middle of that month, she was in the garden pulling the last of the late carrots when Caleb came and sat on the back step and watched her. He did this sometimes, just came and sat and watched her work. She had learned to ignore it in the pleasant sense, the sense of a thing that has become so habitual it no longer requires acknowledgement. Fisher says the north pasture is fully recovered, he said. Better than last year. That's the fence, Grace said, and the wet spring. And the management, Caleb said. She pulled another carrot. It came up clean, which was satisfying. I want to ask you something, he said. You can ask me things without announcing it, she said. I know, but this one I want to announce. He was quiet for a moment. Do you want to add your name to the deed? Grace stopped pulling carrots. She turned and looked at him. "The land deed," he said. "I talked to Fry. It's straightforward, adds your name alongside mine, gives you equal legal standing." He held her eyes. "It's yours. You've been working it like it's yours since November. I want it to be yours on paper too." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a small thing," she said. "I know what it is," he said. She thought about $43 and a temporary arrangement and the way she'd told herself she was being practical every time she stayed. She thought about the word hours that Caleb had used at the kitchen table in her first month, about the money and how it had landed on her like something unexpected and right. "Yes," she said. Caleb nodded. He didn't make it bigger than it was. He just nodded, the way he accepted things that were real and solid and did not require performance. She went back to her carrots. "Fry will need us both to sign," he said. "We'll go Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. The sun was getting low, doing that September thing of going gold in the last hour, and the garden smelled of turned earth and the particular green freshness of late vegetables pulled from cool ground. And somewhere out front, Owen was conducting one of his chicken lectures, his voice carrying in the still evening air with the absolute conviction of someone who has complete faith in the value of what they are saying regardless of the audience's capacity to receive it. Grace pulled the last of the carrots and put them in the basket. She straightened up and looked at the yard, at the ranch, at the fence line and the barn and the house with its chimney and its repaired boards and its mended curtains and its cellar full of jars that she had put up herself, and she thought about the question she'd been unable to answer honestly in those first weeks. "What do you want when this is settled?" And she thought about the answer she'd given, the one that was true but incomplete. "I wanted something that held still." It held still. But it had turned out to be more than that, what she had not known to want, what she had not thought to ask for because she had stopped believing it was available to a woman of $43 and no clear destination, was this, to be necessary. Not useful, not temporary, not filling a gap until something better came along. Necessary. The person without whom a household was diminished. The one who was there when the fever peaked and who faced down a man with a patient smile in a mercantile and who cut the extra slice of cake and who asked a dying man what she should know about the wife he'd lost and sat and listened because a child deserved to have his mother alive in the world in some form. To be necessary was the thing. To be, in the full sense of the word, part of something that would be different and lesser without you. She had built that. She had not been given it. She had looked at a dying man and a frightened child and a broken down house, and she had chosen every day to build it. People talked about courage as though it were a single act, a single moment, the one thing you did when everything was on the line. But she had learned, in this year, that courage was smaller and more persistent than that. It was getting up when Caleb's fever peaked. It was walking out of the mercantile instead of through the door Elliot held open. It was asking the right question when Fry laid the report on the table. It was cutting the cake slightly lopsided and not apologizing for it. Small courage, repeated. That was the whole of it. That was how things got built. On a morning in October, nearly a full year after she'd arrived in Larkin, Grace was at the kitchen table writing out an order for supplies when Owen came down for breakfast earlier than usual and stood in the kitchen doorway with his school bag and his coat and a look on his face that she recognized as something he had been thinking about and had decided it was time to say. "Grace," he said. She looked up. "What do I call you?" he said. "When I'm talking about you to people, at school and anywhere." He held the strap of his bag. "I've been saying Grace, but Mrs. Alderman calls you Mrs. Thornton, and the other kids at school ask, and I don't know what the right word is." She looked at him, at this child who had been on the mercantile steps with a stick a year ago, who had told the county official with complete simplicity that he liked having supper every night with people who didn't look at him like he was a problem, who kept a carved horse and a pocket watch and a photograph and a box of letters from an uncle he was slowly and pragmatically deciding to have. "What word do you want to use?" she said. He looked at his bag strap, looked back at her. "Is it all right if I say mother?" he said. "I won't if it's—" "Owen," she said. He stopped. "It's all right," she said. He nodded, just nodded. Then he went and got his breakfast because he was 8 and he was hungry and there were things that required enormous courage to say and then, once said, became simply the truth, which required nothing further except to be lived. Caleb appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, having heard some portion of the exchange from the hall by the quality of the silence that followed it. He had learned to read the silences in this house the way she had, each one a different shape. He looked at Grace. She looked at him. There was nothing to say, the kind of nothing that is full. He came in and poured his coffee and sat at the table, and the morning began the way it always began. The fire in the stove, and the cold coming through the windows, and the sound of Owen eating with the particular efficiency of a child who is going to be late if he doesn't hurry, which he always was. And Grace picked up her pencil and went back to the supply order, and Caleb drank his coffee, and the house held the three of them in the ordinary way it had learned to hold them. She had come here with $43 and a broken latch and a letter that said, "Speed is essential," and a sensible expectation of nothing beyond $2 a week and a reason to stop moving. What she had now could not be measured the way $43 could be measured. It was not in any document, though her name was going on the deed Thursday. It was in the weight of a boy asleep against her arm on a wagon in the dark. It was in Caleb saying "I love you" with his hands at his sides, not asking for anything, just telling the truth the way she told him she preferred. It was in the cellar full of jars and the repaired fence and the lopsided cake and the chickens that were not improving but were consistently supervised. It was in the word "mother said" by a boy who had chosen it, which was worth more than the word said any other way. You cannot plan for that. You can only do the next right thing, and then the next, and pay attention, and not run when it gets hard, and build. Small courage, repeated the only way anything real ever gets built. Until one morning you look up from your supply order and your family is at the table and the fire is going and the life you are living is the one you made. Grace wrote down flour and salt and coffee and peach preserve jars if available. Outside, a chicken made its opinion known about something. Owen said from the front room where he was gathering his things, "I told you about that," in the tone of someone delivering a warning that has been repeatedly ignored. Caleb looked up from his coffee. He looked at Grace. She did not look up from her list, but she was smiling and she didn't hide it.